Hey guys, tonight we dive into a world where your very existence came with a pre-assigned destiny, and yeah, you probably won't survive this without a few existential jolts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Alright now, first things first, where are you watching from? City? Time? Jot it down in your mind, because in this story, your place and your birth moment might as well be destiny itself. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born into an era when being labelled male or female is not just a biological fact, but a social contract that will dictate every waking hour of your life. There is no neutral ground here. From the first squeak of your lungs, your parents, neighbours and midwives are already assessing your fate with the precision of accountants and the enthusiasm of conspiracy theorists. In some ancient civilizations, such as Sparta, this determination was literal. Male infants were inspected for health and strength, and those deemed weak were abandoned, their fate left to the elements. Meanwhile, girls, considered the carriers of the next generation, were often sheltered or trained rigorously in domestic skills, signalling that survival itself was gendered. You sense, even as a tiny being, that your body is both a vessel and a verdict. You can almost feel the air of superstition wrapping around your crib. There's a charm, a tiny figurine of some deity or animal, placed under your pillow to ensure your proper development. Anthropologists suggest that these early rituals weren't just for show. They represented an attempt to influence luck itself, a kind of pre-scientific public health measure. The fringe side of this? Some of these charms were made from ingredients we would today find bizarre or toxic. Powdered bones, crushed insects, or herbs that modern science would label as either mildly hallucinogenic or flat-out dangerous. Imagine being 3 days old, blissfully unaware, while your parents gamble on your future with the local equivalent of a talismanic life hack. The debate among historians today is surprisingly heated. Some argue these practices were merely protective, akin to modern pediatric caution, while others claim they were tools of social control, designed to train obedience from the cradle. You, lying in the cradle, can't weigh in, of course, but you do feel the invisible tug of expectation. Your very gender is a set of instructions you didn't ask for, but are already expected to follow. In some societies, even the direction of your first cries, north, south, east or west, was interpreted as an omen of your future role. A northward wail might signal martial prowess, a southward one, domestic compliance. You realise very early that your existence is less a birth and more a prognosis. As you grow, you notice subtle cues in the environment. Certain toys are thrust toward you, certain songs sung in your presence, as if the universe itself is guiding you down pre-marked paths. You learn, almost by osmosis, that the world is divided into spaces for boys and spaces for girls. Boys might be given miniature swords or farming tools, girls sewing kits or dolls representing future children. Even playground games are subtly designed to train you for adult expectations. There is a certain absurdity in it too, a kind of cosmic joke. One gender is groomed to strategize and fight, the other to nurture and persuade, and yet both are expected to feel fulfilled by these assignments. You can almost laugh at the theatre of it, if only it weren't so terrifyingly real. Here's a quirky fact. In some cultures, certain male infants were given nonsense names deliberately, names that sounded like gibberish, to trick evil spirits into thinking the child was unworthy of attention, thereby increasing survival chances. Conversely, some female infants were given names invoking strength or prosperity, in a bid to amplify their social value. It's an early lesson. Even your identity, crystallized in a syllable, can be weaponized or celebrated depending on the whims of the culture. You might smile at the creativity of these naming strategies, but underlying them is the cold logic of survival and control. By the end of your first year, you start sensing the broader system at work. Midwives whisper in corners, elders nod approvingly at those who fit the mould, and neighbours exchange glances that communicate everything from pride to disappointment. Even the cradle becomes a symbolic arena, where every action is interpreted as confirmation or contradiction of your assigned destiny. This is where you first encounter what modern scholars describe as the gendered self, an identity largely imposed from without, decades before you could articulate or resist it. The debate rages on. Were these systems protective frameworks meant to prepare children for harsh realities, or were they instruments of oppression designed to channel humans into rigid, predictable roles? You feel the tension, but for now can only absorb it like the air around you. The sensory experience of this world is oddly intense. Imagine the scent of oil lamps mixed with herbs, the constant murmur of prayers, and the gentle but firm hands that guide your body into acceptable positions. Even touch becomes a form of social conditioning. Those who belong to the favoured sex might be swaddled luxuriously, massaged with scented oils, and spoken to in encouraging tones, while the other might receive utilitarian care focused solely on survival. It's subtle, almost subliminal, but your developing mind notices. The world is teaching you who you are expected to be, and the consequences of deviating are already whispered in the air around you. Finally, there is the looming realization: your fate is being written before you can even speak. By the time you take your first steps, the road is paved in expectation. Yet, there is also wonder. In this environment, the small victories, crying at the right moment, reaching for the approved toy, feel momentous. Even compliance becomes a kind of art form. You begin to sense that survival in this era isn't just about avoiding harm. It's about mastering a complex dance of perception, luck, and inherited scripts. In the grand tapestry of history, you're both participant and pawn, learning that sometimes the softest giggles or the quietest compliance carry more weight than any show of strength. By the time you fall asleep tonight, maybe under the same lullaby your ancestors heard centuries ago, the truth is clear. This era is unforgiving, brilliant, terrifying, and bizarre all at once. And here you are, lying on a pillow in the present, imagining yourself as a newborn in that world, feeling the weight of society's invisible hand pressing on your tiny chest. It's a strange cocktail of fear, fascination, and grim humour. You take a deep breath, let the fan hum softly in the background, and prepare to journey further into a world where your sex literally decided everything, from your chores to your destiny, from your cradle to your grave. Welcome to the beginning. You wake the next morning with a strange sense of déjà vu, as if the world is silently cataloguing every twitch of your body, every coo and yawn, and filing it under male or female in some vast cosmic ledger. This is the era where the birth lottery is a very real thing, not metaphorical. From the moment your head emerges, midwives and elders scrutinize your features like judges at an art competition, weighing the tiny angles of your skull, the strength of your cry, the alignment of your fingers. Each detail carries a prediction, a judgment, a whispered assumption about the trajectory of your life. In some ancient societies, like Rome or parts of India, the moment of birth dictated not just your social role, but your legal rights. Male children could inherit property, hold family authority, and eventually wield public power. Female children were expected to marry strategically and manage the household, their voices largely confined to the domestic sphere. You feel an invisible scoreboard being updated with your score before you can even smile. Your family's reaction is immediate, a mix of hope, superstition, and societal pressure. Certain cultures would celebrate the birth of a male child with parades, music, and ritual offerings to gods, while female births might be marked with quieter ceremonies, emphasizing protection, fertility, or preparation for marriage. And here's the kicker. In some parts of Europe during the medieval era, infant girls were sometimes given secondary names specifically to avoid attracting the attention of spirits that supposedly favoured male vitality. You absorb these truths without words, understanding that your very name and existence are political statements, coded signals in the ongoing game of survival and social compliance. It's both thrilling and unnerving. The fringe side of this birth lottery is a little unsettling. Some communities practice deliberate deception of fate. Parents might switch infants at birth, hiding a female child and pretending she was male, hoping to access the privileges of male inheritance. Conversely, infants deemed weak or unfit could be abandoned, left to the mercy of nature. Archaeologists have found ancient burial sites with clusters of infant skeletons, their sex carefully analysed, and the pattern is chilling. Mortality rates were often skewed based on assigned sex. Imagine lying in a cradle, blissfully unaware, while the cosmos, and your society, debates whether you're worth nurturing. The absurdity of it is darkly comic, a tragic theatre in which you're cast before even understanding the lines. Even play is politically charged at this stage. You notice the subtle differences in how adults interact with you depending on your sex. Boys might be encouraged to practice strength, lifting tiny weights, climbing ladders, or carrying buckets, while girls are handed tasks mimicking domestic responsibilities, arranging miniature food, folding cloth, or caring for dolls. The sensory cues are endless. Colours, fabrics, textures, and sounds all signal what is appropriate. Scholars debate whether this early socialization was protective, teaching skills necessary for survival in a harsh world, or oppressive, conditioning compliance and cementing hierarchies from birth. You can feel the tension in this debate every time you reach for a toy not meant for you, or watch another child praised for behaviours you've been silently discouraged from exploring. Food, too, becomes a statement. In some cultures, male infants might be given richer diets to promote growth and strength, while female infants receive more modest rations, preparing them for a life considered less public, less influential. You taste the difference, even if you can't name it. It's subtle. A richer broth here, a thinner porridge there. But the implications are clear. You understand instinctively that survival is not just biological, but social, and even the simplest sip of milk carries weighty lessons about expectation, privilege, and power. You start noticing patterns beyond your immediate household. Neighbours' infants are treated differently, and whispers float through the air. He will be a warrior, she will be a good mother. These are not idle words, they are predictions with societal consequences, almost as binding as law. In Sparta, for example, boys were inspected at birth, and weak males were left to die outside the city gates, while girls were raised to manage homes and produce healthy offspring. In some remote cultures, similar practices were surprisingly literal. Birthmarks or minor deformities were interpreted as omens of future incapacity, influencing whether an infant was fed, clothed, or even carried through the community ritual circuit. You lie in the cradle, absorbing all of this, feeling the gravity of human judgment pressing down before your first teeth even emerge. Here's a quirky historical nugget. In ancient Japan, there were families who practiced male substitution rituals, where a male child's identity could temporarily be passed to a female child for certain rites of passage, effectively tricking spirits and ensuring family blessings. You smile, imagining your infant self in a ceremonial wig, acting as a boy for a week or a month. The logic is whimsical, almost absurd, but the stakes are very real. These early manipulations, by superstition, ritual, or desperation, underscore the fragility and arbitrariness of your fate. As you grow into the early months, you start internalizing what it means to be the sex you are assigned. You notice the difference in attention, the variation in smiles or frowns, the subtle signals of approval. You learn quickly that society communicates not just through rules, but through nuances of touch, tone, and timing. Some scholars argue that this early conditioning created what we now call the gendered self, while others claim it's more a survival adaptation, a strategy to navigate perilous social environments. Either way, it is happening around you and to you. The key takeaway, and something you feel even as a barely mobile infant, is that this era operates like a giant unwritten ledger. One column for male, one for female, with obligations, expectations, and rewards pre-filled. You're assigned to a column before you can articulate preference, skill, or desire. And yet, in the quiet moments, when the fan hums softly in the background, when the midwife steps away, when your cradle swings gently, you sense tiny flickers of autonomy. You might not be able to rewrite the rules, but you begin noticing them, cataloguing them, storing them in a secret corner of your mind for later rebellion or negotiation. Survival, it seems, will be part compliance, part observation, part cunning. By the time you drift into your first nap, the magnitude of this birth lottery settles over you like a blanket heavier than your tiny frame can carry. And yet, as in every era, there is space for wonder. The same cradle that enforces destiny also cradles imagination. The same ritual that controls also sparks curiosity, and the same predictions that constrain also invite subtle, if dangerous, questioning. You start to understand that being born male or female in this world is less about anatomy and more about participation in an elaborate, centuries-old game of fate, a game in which everyone plays from day one, whether they want to or not. By the time you reach your first year, you're no longer just an infant. You're an observed phenomenon, a living statement of what society believes a male or female should be. Welcome to the world of infancy rules and rituals, where every coo, every stretch of your limbs, every tiny grasp of a finger or toy is scrutinized, noted, and interpreted. You start noticing that your caregivers speak differently to you, depending on the sex you are assigned. If you are male, their voices carry subtle encouragements for strength, courage, and assertiveness, sometimes paired with brief, ritualized touches on the arms or chest meant to harden you. If you are female, their tones are softer, more melodic, often paired with gestures encouraging gentleness, compliance, or domestic readiness. Even at this age, you sense the invisible scaffolding being erected around your mind and body, a structure that will guide, restrict, and define the rest of your life. In ancient cultures like Egypt, this stage of life was not just practical but ceremonial. Midwives would perform rites over infants, sometimes invoking deities to bless health, strength, or beauty. Boys were presented to gods associated with leadership and war, girls to goddesses linked with fertility and domestic skill. It's fascinating, and a little unsettling, to realise that these practices were meant to codify your fit into the social machine before you could even crawl. Anthropologists today debate whether these ceremonies were protective measures, ensuring infant survival in environments with high mortality rates, or psychological conditioning designed to maintain rigid gender hierarchies. You, of course, are too small to ponder such debates, but the weight of them lands on you anyway, like the faint vibration of a distant drum. Some of the fringe practices are almost absurd in their creativity. In parts of Southeast Asia, families would attach tiny amulets or charms directly to the infant's skin, often over sensitive areas like the belly or wrist, claiming the objects would steer destiny toward the sex-appropriate virtues. One family might embed a miniature sword-shaped charm under a boy's blanket, hoping it would instill courage. Another might fasten a miniature spinning wheel over a girl's crib, symbolically preparing her for domestic skill. Archaeological evidence shows some of these charms were made of materials that would surprise a modern mind. Crushed shells, tiny bones, even ground gemstones. Imagine lying in your cradle, unknowingly wearing a jewellery-like device meant to determine the course of your life. It's whimsical, almost laughable, but deadly serious in intent. Even feeding routines are gendered in ways that shape both body and expectation. Boys often receive richer, protein-heavy diets, designed to promote early strength and growth. Girls might receive more modest portions, sometimes supplemented with herbs believed to enhance patience, beauty, or calmness. You may not recognise it yet, but each bite is a lesson, an instruction in the social code that your body is expected to enact. Scholars today still debate the long-term effects of these early interventions. Were they merely practical nutritional strategies, or were they early forms of social engineering, subtly privileging one sex over the other in preparation for adulthood? Either way, you sense the difference, even if only as a faint echo of flavour and texture. Your senses are constantly engaged in this world. The sound of whispered blessings, the faint scent of oils used to massage and strengthen you, the texture of swaddling cloth chosen for gendered comfort, all of it contributes to a subconscious understanding of who you are supposed to be. This is where the term gendered cradle could literally apply. Even the environment of your first months is tailored to reinforce the social story written for your sex. Some fringe historical accounts suggest that certain infant cradles were even angled or padded differently for boys versus girls, supposedly to influence posture, coordination, or future grace. Imagine lying there, every tiny adjustment, every lullaby, a carefully calibrated effort to mould you before you could resist. You start noticing subtle signals from extended family and community members too. Neighbours' reactions are immediate and revealing. A male infant who smiles easily is praised for his future leadership qualities, while a female infant who cries loudly might be admonished to develop patience and self-control. One could argue this is just attentive caregiving, but historians suggest it's more than that. It's a pre-indoctrination of social hierarchy, a mechanism to reinforce expected roles and prevent deviation from the assigned script. Even now, lying in the soft cradle, you feel the first brush of accountability. Your existence is not private. It is already a public performance scored by invisible judges. There's also an element of ritualized risk. In Sparta, for instance, male infants judged weak were sometimes left on hillsides to face nature's judgment. Female infants, while less likely to be exposed to the elements, were still subject to rigorous social vetting. Their health, temperament, and compliance would determine future marital arrangements, inheritance rights, and societal standing. Fringe accounts suggest some societies practiced temporary trial swaps, where infants were exchanged with distant families for a few weeks, as if to test resilience or divine favour. The stakes are staggering. Survival, opportunity, even the right to exist within a community depends not only on physical health, but on performing your sex-appropriate role from day one. By the time you crawl or wobble on chubby legs, you're participating in the first structured phase of life designed to enforce your assigned sex. You notice adults' reactions to your movements, a boy encouraged to explore and test limits, a girl guided gently to manage objects delicately. You feel the subtle pressure of conformity, but also, strangely, the exhilaration of discovery. There is a quiet rebellion in every stretch, every curiosity-driven exploration, even if it's tiny. Scholars today argue that these early years were pivotal in shaping lifelong gender behaviour, though debates persist over nature versus nurture, and whether social enforcement or biological predisposition played the dominant role. You absorb both sides of the debate without conscious thought, like a sponge taking in water and dye together. Quirky practices continue to pepper daily life. In certain parts of India, male infants were sometimes given ritualized strength baths, in water, infused with herbs and minerals, intended to imbue courage and virility. Female infants might receive scented oils and gentle massage meant to soften the heart and enhance beauty and obedience. Some historians view these as merely symbolic gestures. Others suggest that early sensory exposure shaped temperament, subtly reinforcing gendered expectations. You might giggle if you could, imagining your tiny self sloshing in herbal baths, already being trained to fit a rigid mould you didn't choose. By the end of this stage, you realise that your life is a delicate negotiation between survival, expectation, and social scripting. Every touch, sound, and morsel is part of a broader curriculum in which the assigned sex dictates both immediate treatment and distant potential. And yet, there is wonder. The same cradle that imposes constraints also fosters imagination. The same hands that guide subtly also teach curiosity. The same rituals that bind also create memory and connection. You float in this awareness, even as an infant, understanding intuitively that your world is as much about rules as it is about the fleeting, fragile, beautiful unpredictability of existence itself. By the time your eyelids grow heavy and you drift into sleep, the first year of life, the birth lottery, the charms, the whispered prayers, the carefully orchestrated diets, has laid the foundation for everything to come. You feel, without yet naming it, the invisible scaffolding around you, the social currents that will carry you forward, and the tiny cracks where observation, wit, and perhaps rebellion might one day slip through. And somewhere deep in the soft hum of a fan or the gentle creak of a cradle, you know this. Being born is not just survival. It is the opening act of a story in which your sex determines, but does not entirely dictate, your fate. As you toddle into early childhood, you begin to see the world in pre-marked lanes, like a playground painted with invisible rules. This is where the childhood paths split, and you realise that the toy you pick up, the games you play, and even the songs sung to you are quietly but firmly teaching you who you are supposed to be. Boys are subtly encouraged toward movement, risk, and physical coordination. Girls toward domestic mimicry, patience, and relational awareness. Even at this tender age, your society is a sophisticated instructor, using subtle cues to shepherd you along a predetermined path. You sense it in the tone of a relative's voice, the glance of a neighbour, or the faint reprimand if you reach for a toy meant for the other sex. In ancient Rome, for example, boys were given miniature tools, mock weapons, and toys that encouraged strategic thinking, while girls were presented with dolls, small cooking implements, or woven objects designed to simulate domestic tasks. The historical fact is simple. Your society believes your gender dictates the skills you will need to survive and thrive. The more you observe, the more you realise that play is not just fun. It is a rehearsal for life. Even the arrangement of space is telling. Boys are allowed to explore rougher terrain in courtyards. Girls are often guided toward quiet corners where they learn dexterity and patience. The distinction is omnipresent, invisible yet unmistakable. You notice too how social interactions are governed by unspoken rules. Boys are praised for assertiveness, girls for compliance. Boys are encouraged to negotiate and even compete, girls to nurture and harmonise. There is an odd, almost humorous absurdity in it. You could see two children arguing over a game of stones, and the adults' reactions are less about fairness than about reinforcing the proper social script. The fringe side of this era is wild. Some cultures would even dress boys and girls identically for short periods to test temperament or divine favour, observing which child naturally gravitates toward their expected behaviours. Imagine being 5, unknowingly participating in a sociological experiment that determines your social credit for years to come. Scholars today still debate the long-term psychological effects of these early divisions. Were they protective structures that ensured survival in harsh environments, or mechanisms of control designed to maintain hierarchies and limit social mobility? You feel the tension of this debate in every corner of your playtime. Even choosing a stick to chase imaginary foes, or a doll to tuck into bed, becomes a subtle negotiation of compliance and self-expression. You understand, without knowing why, that your small decisions have outsized consequences, that this is training, observation, and social policing all at once. Meals are another domain where gender subtly enforces expectations. Boys might be given hearty, protein-rich portions to build strength and endurance. Girls smaller servings emphasising refinement and health for future childbearing. These choices are rarely conscious acts of oppression. They're embedded in cultural logic and the science of the era, or at least what passes for science. And yet, they reinforce the invisible ledger. Male bodies are prepared for public labour and defence, female bodies for domestic and reproductive work. You can almost taste the unspoken rules in the texture, flavour and portion size of every meal. It's an education of the palate as much as the mind or body. Here's a quirky historical detail. In certain Polynesian societies, boys were encouraged to play in ways that simulated fishing or canoe building, while girls were given miniature versions of weaving looms, teaching skills that would later define adulthood. Anthropologists suggest that these practices weren't just practical. They were ritualized early training, designed to shape not only physical skills, but also social roles and expectations. You might giggle at the ingenuity, or perhaps the absurdity of these training toys, imagining your tiny hands learning to fish or weave long before you could walk confidently. But there is seriousness beneath the whimsy. Mastering these early tasks signalled readiness to fulfill the roles society demanded of you. Education itself is also split along gender lines even at this young age. In some medieval European homes, boys were taught reading, numeracy and strategy, while girls learned embroidery, music and social etiquette. This separation shapes not just your skill set, but your worldview. You notice that the knowledge deemed appropriate for your sex opens doors in certain areas and closes them in others. Scholars still debate whether this early divergence was necessary for survival in historical societies, or whether it entrenched inequality that later generations would struggle to overcome. You sense the contours of that debate as you navigate the small lessons of your day: how to carry a basket, how to compete, how to please an elder. Play itself is a theatre of observation. Adults watch how you interact with peers, interpreting each choice as confirmation or contradiction of societal expectations. In some cultures, a child demonstrating inappropriate play, for example, a boy showing care for dolls or a girl exhibiting aggression, might be quietly corrected, sometimes through teasing, sometimes through ritual instruction. Fringe examples are even stranger. In certain parts of Africa, children's play was ritualistically monitored by older community members who would adjust the environment to see if children naturally conformed to sex-specific norms. You absorb all of this without complaint because at this stage, observation is part of life itself. By age 5 or 6, you begin to internalise these paths as natural, not arbitrary. You notice the subtle pressures, boys do this, girls do that, becomes a mantra you feel rather than hear. And yet, there is space for small acts of rebellion. A boy might linger over a doll for a moment. A girl might climb a tree just far enough to draw a gasp. These moments are dangerous and exhilarating, small flickers of agency in a tightly regulated world. Some historians argue that these early acts of defiance shaped later social change, suggesting that the very rigidity of childhood paths planted seeds for cultural evolution. You feel that tension even as a child, the gravity of expectation and the thrill of tiny transgression. You notice that clothing too marks this split. Boys might wear tunics that allow freedom of movement, girls dresses that restrict it subtly, signalling the roles each is expected to play. Fabrics, colours, and adornments are messages, silent yet potent, confirming the invisible scripts guiding your life. Fringe historical notes even suggest that some families experimented with temporary swaps of clothing and hairstyles to test a child's adaptability or divine favour. Imagine trying to play the same game in a dress designed to signal domesticity. It's awkward, a little funny, and profoundly instructive about the invisible power structures around you. Finally, by the end of this early childhood stage, you have learned the essential truth of the era. Life is pre-divided along the axis of sex, and navigating it requires observation, compliance, and occasional subtle rebellion. Your toys, meals, clothes, and social interactions are all coded instructions in a program written before you could speak. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the sun slants softly through a window, when your hands grasp at a blade of grass or a sibling's sleeve, you sense that there is room for curiosity, creativity, and resistance, however small. You start to understand that being born into this system is both a limitation and a lesson, a paradox of confinement and discovery that will shape every stage of your life. By the time you lie down at night, exhausted from a day of guided exploration, the division of childhood paths is etched into your body and mind, and yet, the soft hum of the fan, the gentle rustle of curtains, the fleeting moments of choice and surprise whisper a different story. One in which your destiny is written, yes, but not entirely fixed. The era may decide much, but you are already learning the subtle art of reading the rules, bending them, and perhaps someday rewriting them. As you step out of early childhood and into the first whispers of formal learning, you feel the first real weight of education and forbidden knowledge pressing against your small shoulders. The classroom, or whatever passes for it in your society, is not neutral. The lessons, materials, and even the attention you receive are all filtered through the lens of your assigned sex. If you are a boy, you're encouraged to pursue reading, arithmetic, and strategic thinking, preparing for leadership, trade, or military service. If you are a girl, your studies often focus on embroidery, music, etiquette, and domestic management, the skills deemed essential for household authority and marital negotiation. You feel, even before understanding the curriculum, that some doors are wide open while others are quietly bolted. Historically, this isn't just conjecture. In ancient Athens, girls were largely excluded from formal learning, receiving only basic instruction in household management, while boys were trained in rhetoric, philosophy, and mathematics, preparing them for civic participation. You sit on the edge of understanding, sensing the unequal distribution of knowledge as both a limitation and a form of societal control. There's a rigid logic to it, yes, but it also carries a quiet tragedy. So much potential, determined before the child even knows curiosity. You notice the difference in the books, the scrolls, the objects around you. Everything is coded. Then there are the fringe practices, the odd rituals bordering superstition. In some medieval European convents, young girls were sometimes allowed access to Latin texts, but only under strict supervision and only for the purpose of memorizing prayers. The authorities feared that girls reading freely might gain dangerous knowledge, challenge domestic expectations, or even think independently. Meanwhile, boys could wander the same spaces freely, access multiple disciplines and debate their lessons. You imagine yourself in one of these early classrooms, tiny hands tracing letters, while a stern teacher ensures every word aligns with what society considers appropriate. The tension between curiosity and restriction is palpable, and you feel it physically, like a light pressure on your chest. The debate among scholars is surprisingly heated. Was this separation a necessary adaptation to the conditions of the time, ensuring survival and social order, or was it an early form of systematic oppression, deliberately designed to suppress one half of society's potential? You don't know, and yet you feel the answer in the rhythm of your day. Every lesson, every punishment, every word of praise or reprimand is part of a larger narrative that is as invisible as it is binding. You notice, even as a child, that knowledge itself is not neutral. Access and restriction are powerful tools. You can almost hear the whispers of forbidden knowledge everywhere. Boys might be encouraged to learn tactical games and reading that cultivates abstract thought, while girls are subtly directed away from anything deemed too challenging or public. Yet curiosity persists. Some girls would secretly memorize letters, numbers, or herbal remedies from whispered lessons or hidden scrolls, becoming clandestine scholars. Some boys, on the other hand, would experiment with domestic skills in secret, showing small cracks in the rigid system. You feel that tension in every glance at a forbidden object, every quiet experiment with a toy or tool not meant for you. It's thrilling and frightening all at once. Even the physical environment reinforces these divisions. Desks, chairs, and even the layout of the space are subtly gendered. Boys' seats might allow freedom of movement for active thinking, while girls' areas are smaller, more contained, and sometimes less ventilated, reflecting the assumption that their minds should be focused on domestic or aesthetic concerns. Fringe accounts suggest that some teachers would deliberately place mirrors in girls' learning areas to remind them of beauty and comportment, while boys' desks might face open windows, symbolizing exploration and the outside world. You feel the absurdity, the artistry, and the cruelty of it all as you navigate these tiny spaces, absorbing rules you didn't choose. Your meals, too, reflect this early educational divide. Boys might be fed portions that stimulate energy and growth, girls' portions that are meant to encourage composure and grace. It's subtle, but unmistakable. Every bite, every sip reinforces societal expectations, shaping your physical and cognitive development simultaneously. Anthropologists suggest that these early dietary interventions were practical adaptations for survival, yet they doubled as a form of social engineering. You sense this dual purpose intuitively. Tasting more than food, you taste instruction, expectation, and control. At play, knowledge is also stratified. Boys may be permitted to explore logic and strategy games that build problem-solving skills, while girls are given social games designed to cultivate patience, empathy, and domestic foresight. The friction is constant. What you want to do versus what is permitted is a daily negotiation. Even at this age, some children cleverly subvert rules. Girls hiding objects to study them, boys sneaking into domestic play to mimic caregiving. You notice these rebellions, understanding without words that intelligence and creativity rarely respect imposed boundaries. Quirky historical examples abound. In some parts of India, young girls were given access to small astronomical instruments under strict supervision to chart the stars, but only for religious purposes, not scientific inquiry. Boys, meanwhile, could study the same instruments freely and debate their practical applications for navigation or warfare. You imagine handling a tiny astrolabe, aware that your curiosity is allowed only in a narrow, ritualized corridor. The absurdity is tangible, yet the stakes are real. Knowledge is a key, but the key is handed out unequally, and every move is monitored. By the end of this stage, you sense the full weight of the educational system as a tool of fate. What you're allowed to learn, and what is withheld, shapes not just your skills, but your worldview, your self-conception, and even your ambitions. You begin to understand that learning is never neutral here. It is a negotiation of power, expectation, and survival. And yet, the cracks remain. Tiny moments of defiance, secret memorization, subtle curiosity all hint that knowledge, once glimpsed, can't be entirely contained. Even in an era so strict, human ingenuity finds ways to slip between the lines. As the sun sets and your eyelids grow heavy, you reflect, if only subconsciously, on what learning means in a world governed by sex and societal expectation. Education is not merely information. It is a map of your place in the social order, a set of instructions, and occasionally a hidden tool for rebellion. You drift into sleep, the fan humming softly in the background, the weight of your cradle, your lessons, and your invisible ledger pressing gently against you. You feel, without yet naming it, that knowledge is both a gift and a cage, a pathway and a boundary, and that your journey through it will shape everything that comes next. By the time you're roughly 10 years old, you start to notice a shift. The world no longer hovers around your cradle or classroom, it is pressing in, pointing, and nudging you toward first glimpse of work expectations. Suddenly, play and learning merge into preparation for the roles your society has assigned you. Boys are subtly encouraged to haul, carry, and manage physical tasks, sometimes disguised as chores, but really as early vocational training. Girls are guided into domestic practices, cooking, weaving, cleaning, and managing small responsibilities. Even the smallest misstep, a boy neglecting to lift a heavy bucket, a girl fumbling with thread, is observed and sometimes quietly corrected, reinforcing the invisible rule that your sex determines not just who you are, but what work you will perform for the rest of your life. Historically, in medieval Europe, this stage of childhood was crucial. Boys were apprenticed to trades, tending livestock or learning craft skills within the household or village workshops, while girls were often tasked with preparing for domestic management, spinning, sewing, and overseeing younger siblings. These tasks weren't arbitrary. They reflected the labour needs of society and reinforced the division of labour along gender lines. You experience the weight of expectation physically, noticing that even your games have started to resemble real work. Picking up sticks for swordplay or dolls for caretaking feels like rehearsal for a script written decades before your birth. Fringe practices make these early labour lessons almost theatrical. In parts of ancient China, children would participate in miniature market simulations. Boys learned to trade, calculate and bargain, while girls were trained to negotiate dowries or manage household inventories. These exercises were not purely practical. They were ritualized forms of social conditioning, teaching lessons in compliance, observation and hierarchy. You imagine yourself in such a simulation, tiny fingers fumbling with pretend coins, already feeling the pressure of adult-level responsibility pressed into small hands. The absurdity and genius of it make you smile inwardly, if only you had the ability to express it aloud. This stage of life also introduces you to peer comparison in work expectations. You notice friends praised or admonished based on how well they align with sex-assigned tasks. Boys who fail to demonstrate strength or initiative in chores are gently shamed, while girls who resist domestic lessons are subtly corrected or teased. You sense the dual function of this system. It ensures labour efficiency and simultaneously polices behaviour, making obedience a survival strategy. The scholarly debate is fierce. Some historians argue these practices were essential for economic stability and survival. Others suggest they were designed to entrench social hierarchies, restricting upward mobility and fostering compliance from an early age. You don't consciously ponder these debates, but you feel them in every task, every correction, every glance of approval or disapproval. Your daily life is filled with ritualized preparation. Boys might wake early to fetch water, stack firewood, or accompany older males on hunting or labour trips. Girls might spend hours weaving, cooking, or learning to manage household accounts. In some ancient societies, the sensory experience is carefully curated. The smell of herbs and fresh bread, the weight of small tools in your hands, the cadence of repetitive tasks, all function as training for adulthood. Fringe anthropological findings suggest that some tasks even had embedded tests of dexterity or problem-solving, rewarding the child who could adapt while subtly punishing those who struggled. You feel these tests as both challenge and warning. Perform well, or your path narrows. By now, the boundaries between play, learning and work are blurred. Boys practicing archery with miniature bows are preparing for defense and hunting. Girls arranging dolls or cooking implements are practicing household management and family negotiation. You begin to internalize these roles physically and mentally. The tactile experience, weight, balance, rhythm, is a subtle teacher. Scholars debate whether such early conditioning is inherently oppressive or whether it simply reflects the necessity of preparing children for survival in labour-intensive societies. Your small successes and failures are catalogued by the adults around you, sometimes noted in conversation, sometimes merely observed. Either way, you are acutely aware that your performance matters. Social expectations also begin to influence ambition. Boys learn that physical prowess, courage, and initiative open doors. Girls learn that patience, attention to detail, and the ability to please authority are the currency of influence. You start noticing the invisible rewards and punishments, praise, privileges, extra food, or social recognition. Conversely, failure is met with gentle criticism, extra chores, or pointed reminders of your sex-assigned role. Fringe accounts describe some societies using symbolic tests. A boy might be challenged to carry a basket of grain without spilling, a girl to arrange coloured threads perfectly under the watchful eye of an elder. Success signals readiness for adult responsibilities. Failure carries subtle, lingering social consequences. By now, you sense that work expectations are not just tasks. They are social currency and status markers. Completing them skillfully earns recognition, sometimes privileges, and sometimes early leadership opportunities, particularly for boys. Girls gain social capital differently. Adeptness at domestic management earns praise, trust, and eventual influence within households or extended kin networks. You absorb these lessons as both instructions and warnings. Your sex determines the work you're expected to master, the skills you will be praised for, and the ways society measures your worth. Even minor deviations carry potential consequences, teaching vigilance, adaptability, and sometimes quiet cunning. Curiously, this period also fosters early ambition, subtly moulded by social constraints. Boys dream of heroic acts, trades, or leadership within the community. Girls envision competence, beauty, or household mastery. Fringe rituals in some indigenous cultures even formalize this. Boys and girls might participate in early competitions or simulations designed to identify aptitude and potential, often observed by elders who interpret the outcomes as predictive of adult roles. You feel the thrill and anxiety of these tests, aware that your body, behaviour and attention are constantly evaluated. The pressure is invisible yet omnipresent, and it begins shaping not only what you do but who you believe you can be. By the time evening falls and the day's chores and lessons conclude, you're both exhausted and exhilarated. You realise that even at this young age, the world is less about personal choice and more about responding to expectation, observation, and tacit instruction. Your muscles remember the weight of baskets, your fingers remember the rhythm of weaving, your mind catalogues patterns of approval and reprimand. And yet, in the quiet moments, the hum of the evening air, the soft sway of a lantern, the faint scent of food cooking, you notice small gaps, tiny cracks in the rigidity. These moments hint that observation, cleverness, and subtle defiance may one day offer a way to navigate or even bend the constraints placed on you. As you finally lie down to sleep, the weight of expectation and observation presses on you like an invisible cloak. Yet the quiet comfort of your room, the soft hum of life around you, reminds you that even in a world determined by sex, there is room to notice, to learn, and perhaps to subvert. Work is no longer just labour. It is an early lesson in survival, obedience, and cunning, a prelude to the intricate dance your sex-assigned destiny has scripted for you. And in the quiet of that night, as you drift towards sleep, you carry the subtle, exhilarating knowledge that the paths ahead, while heavily preordained, are not entirely fixed. As you enter your early teens, your body begins to betray the signals society has been anticipating for years, and suddenly, adolescent pressure cooker becomes your daily reality. Puberty arrives not as a private transformation, but as a public, heavily monitored, socially charged event. You feel the first stirrings of hormones and notice that everyone else seems equally aware. Girls experience changes in body shape, menstruation, and the onset of fertility. Boys notice sudden growth spurts, voice cracks, and increased strength. Adults interpret every sign as confirmation of your future role, your worth, your labour potential, your eligibility for marriage, or your readiness to assume leadership. You realise that adolescence in this era is less a time of self-discovery and more a highly visible exam administered by the entire community. Historically, in societies like Sparta, boys were sent to agog training at the onset of puberty, a brutal mix of education, survival and combat preparation designed to turn them into warriors. Girls were instructed in domestic management, weaving and childbearing skills, often under the watchful eyes of matrons and elders. In some cases, rituals coincided with the first menstruation, marking a girl's passage into socially recognised womanhood. You feel this pressure acutely, understanding without words that every twitch, every new curve, every stumble is already being interpreted as either readiness or deficiency. Adolescence, in this context, is a spotlight you can never escape. The fringe rituals make it almost surreal. In certain Mesoamerican cultures, boys underwent tests of endurance and bravery, swimming in rivers, running barefoot over hot stones, or climbing dangerous heights. Girls, on the other hand, participated in ceremonial dances and weaving contests timed with their first menstruation, symbolising fertility, beauty, and domestic readiness. You imagine yourself participating in these tests, tiny feet scraping the ground, hands trembling as you perform tasks designed to predict your social and sexual value for years to come. The sheer theatricality of it is almost comic, but beneath the spectacle lies profound consequence. You notice that peer interaction is increasingly politicised. Friendships are often filtered through the lens of gendered expectations. Boys bond over contests of skill and strength, girls over cooperation and social aptitude. Deviations are noted and often corrected. Some boys secretly envy girls' dexterity in domestic crafts. Some girls long for the thrill of climbing or physical competition. These desires are considered dangerous in some communities because they challenge the rigidly defined path society has imposed. Anthropologists today debate the psychological impact of this stage. Does early social enforcement strengthen cultural cohesion and survival, or does it suppress creativity, reinforce inequality, and cement harmful hierarchies? You feel the tension, like a low hum, vibrating under your skin, even as you play or train. Physical appearance becomes another marker of societal evaluation. Boys are expected to develop muscularity, endurance, and height that signals strength. Girls are scrutinized for curves, posture, and skin tone that indicate fertility and grace. Fringe accounts suggest some societies employed cosmetic rituals even for teenagers. Boys might have received herbal tonics or small tattoos believed to enhance virility, while girls might be given powders, oils, or protective amulets designed to maintain perceived beauty or social favour. Imagine brushing powdered herbs on your skin, aware that adults are assessing your body like a ledger of social potential. It's both absurd and terrifying. Education during adolescence is equally segregated and loaded with expectation. Boys are given lessons in strategy, law, and trade skills, often paired with physical trials. Girls continue in domestic arts, but may also study social politics, etiquette, and sometimes even herbal medicine. You begin to realise that every piece of knowledge is tied directly to your sex-assigned role. Some scholars argue that these systems functioned as early vocational training, while others insist they were rigid mechanisms to preserve power structures and control reproductive labour. You feel both arguments intuitively. Every lesson is a tool and a cage. Romantic and marital prospects start hovering on the periphery. Girls are subtly taught that attractiveness, composure, and social grace are essential for securing advantageous matches. Boys are informed, sometimes explicitly, sometimes tacitly, that strength, courage, and reputation determine social and economic success. Fringe anthropologists describe some societies staging mock courtship rituals for adolescents, teaching boys to demonstrate valour and girls to display compliance or charm. You can almost feel the weight of expectation as you watch peers navigate these practices, realising that even fleeting actions can influence your future opportunities. Adolescence here is a rehearsal for social survival, a constant audition for roles determined long before birth. Even rebellion carries a heavy price. Boys who shirk physical labour or pursue traditionally female skills might face ridicule, public reprimand, or reduced status. Girls who climb trees, spar with peers, or ignore domestic instruction are similarly censured. Yet subtle defiance persists. Some children experiment quietly with forbidden skills, share secret knowledge, or express hidden desires. Scholars debate whether these small acts of rebellion were seeds for social evolution, challenging gender rigidity and creating alternative pathways for those willing to risk ostracism. You sense the thrill of these moments, a quiet pulse of autonomy beneath the otherwise relentless tide of expectation. You begin noticing that small rituals punctuate adolescence as markers of transition. Boys might be given weapons or ceremonial clothing, girls might receive jewellery, symbolic clothing, or ritual instruction tied to fertility and domestic authority. These rituals serve both to instruct and to display. They communicate social rank, readiness, and conformity. Fringe practices sometimes involved more extreme tests, like fasting, controlled exposure to environmental challenges, or symbolic trials of endurance. The goal is consistent across cultures, to measure, classify, and prepare the adolescent body and mind for the responsibilities their sex dictates. You feel yourself being measured, in ways both overt and subliminal, like a tiny instrument calibrated for societal expectations. By the end of adolescence, the pressure cooker reaches a boiling point. Physical changes, social instruction, and ceremonial rites converge, leaving you acutely aware of your assigned trajectory. You notice that compliance brings reward, approval, privileges, and social recognition, while minor deviations risk social friction or subtle punishment. At the same time, tiny gaps in this rigid system provide openings for ingenuity, personal growth, or strategic rebellion. You realise that mastery of this delicate balance, obedience tempered with creativity, will define your ability to navigate life successfully. The entire era feels like a high-stakes game in which your body, mind, and social intelligence are constantly scored, and even small errors can reverberate for years. By the time evening arrives, and your muscles ache from a day of lessons, chores, and subtle tests, you lie down with an almost paradoxical feeling, exhaustion and exhilaration intertwined. You have survived the daily scrutiny of adolescence, learned the subtle dance of expectation, and glimpsed the fissures in the social order. In these quiet moments, as the soft hum of a fan or distant night sounds lull you towards sleep, you sense that adolescence is not merely a stage of growth but a crucible. It forges strength, compliance, skill, and awareness, yet also leaves space for subtle defiance, observation, and strategy. You drift off, aware that your body, your choices, and your very existence are more than biology. They are a map of social expectation, a ledger of survival, and a canvas for your first tentative acts of autonomy. As your teenage years continue, you can no longer ignore what everyone around you has been quietly signalling: the marriage market madness. Suddenly the world isn't just about labour, education, or social standing. It's about your value in an intricate system designed to trade people like commodities. You begin to notice glances, whispered assessments, and subtle gestures from adults and peers alike. Girls are taught to measure their worth in beauty, composure, and the ability to manage a household, while boys are evaluated for strength, reputation, and the ability to provide or protect. Even casual conversations in your presence often revolve around future partnerships, alliances, and social networks, and you feel, with a mixture of curiosity and dread, that your body and behaviour are constantly under review. Historically, in many societies, this stage of life was the first where marriage negotiations had real consequences. In medieval Europe, elite families began arranging matches when girls reached puberty, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, to secure political or economic alliances. Boys, meanwhile, were observed for physical capability, skill in trade or warfare, and social standing before being considered viable suitors. You sense that these negotiations are less about love and more about strategy, a high-stakes chess game in which your body, reputation, and even temperament are pieces to be moved according to societal rules. The system is both intimidating and strangely fascinating, a reflection of how deeply your sex shapes destiny. The fringe practices make the marriage market even more bizarre. In parts of India and the Middle East, families would present young girls during elaborate ceremonies that included symbolic dances, clothing displays, and even ritualized evaluations of poise, speech, and endurance. Boys might be asked to demonstrate hunting skills, combat readiness, or trade knowledge before being deemed suitable for matrimony. Imagine yourself as a teenager, tiny and nervous, participating in these formalized evaluations. One misstep or awkward gesture could shift the balance of your social value. It is almost theatrical, like a live performance in which stakes are both public and deeply personal. Social perception becomes the currency of value. Your actions, words, and even appearance are carefully calibrated to signal readiness and desirability. You notice that small details matter. A boy's posture, a girl's gaze, the quality of a dress or tool demonstration, all can affect how adults and peers evaluate your future potential. Scholars debate the long-term psychological impact of this constant scrutiny. Does it foster social skills, adaptability and strategy, or does it generate anxiety, conformity, and self-policing that stifles individuality? You feel the tension firsthand, aware that every gesture can enhance or diminish your social currency, yet still seeking subtle ways to assert choice within these constraints. Family influence is paramount. Elders act as negotiators, mentors, and sometimes enforcers, guiding or pressuring you toward behaviours that maximise your perceived value. Boys may be instructed to demonstrate courage, generosity, or skill in labour. Girls are coached to manage tasks gracefully, maintain composure under observation, and display qualities deemed socially advantageous. Fringe practices sometimes extended to cosmetic rituals. Boys might be bathed in fragrant oils or receive symbolic tattoos to indicate vitality, while girls could be adorned with powders, jewellery, or other markers signalling health and beauty. The absurdity of these ceremonies contrasts sharply with their seriousness. a constant reminder that survival and social advancement are inseparable from performance. You start noticing the market-like mechanics of this system. The social world is divided into networks, each evaluating, trading, and arranging alliances. Older children act as both participants and observers, learning how reputation, skill, and appearance translate into opportunities or restrictions. Some adolescents subtly resist, testing boundaries through minor acts of defiance or secret skill building. Scholars note that these early experiences of negotiation and evaluation often shaped later social competence and strategy, highlighting the complex interplay between compliance and innovation. You feel this tension in your chest, sensing both risk and possibility as you navigate expectations and personal impulses. Peer comparison amplifies the pressure. You notice which boys or girls receive praise, attention, or privileges, and which are quietly ignored or critiqued. Success is often contingent on aligning behaviour with societal norms, yet slight deviations may be tolerated, or even secretly admired, as long as they don't disrupt the overall social order. You experience an almost constant internal calculation. What will gain approval? What will endanger social standing? And what small acts of individuality might be safely expressed? Even minor gestures, a well-timed smile, a deftly handled task, a subtle act of defiance, carry meaning far beyond their immediate context. Cultural rituals also shape perception. In parts of Africa, coming-of-age ceremonies involved dancing, storytelling, and endurance tasks that subtly evaluated physical skill, social poise, and reproductive readiness. Boys and girls were observed by elders who interpreted performances as predictive of adult competency. Fringe anthropological studies suggest that some societies even included secret competitions, testing memory, problem-solving, and adaptability under pressure. You can almost see yourself in these ceremonies, a mix of excitement and dread, aware that the world is both watching and recording every gesture, every expression, every measured success or failure. Economic considerations intersect with social evaluation. Marriage is rarely just a personal matter. It is a negotiation involving land, livestock, trade partnerships, and household resources. Your perceived potential is not limited to attractiveness or skill. It extends to the capacity to generate value, manage assets, and maintain social cohesion. You sense that even small demonstrations of competence, lifting a basket, tending animals, preparing food, or negotiating a minor household dispute, are silently noted and remembered, building a dossier that may influence your future for years. The stakes of adolescence suddenly feel enormous, as if every day is a miniature audition for life itself. By now you understand that your sex is both passport and cage. It opens doors in some directions while closing others, signalling societal approval and potential punishment in equal measure. The marriage market is a living system, dynamic yet rigid, where negotiation, observation, and reputation intersect. You see that even small acts of subtle rebellion, secretly practicing a skill not assigned to your sex, questioning norms, or expressing a fleeting preference, carry risk but also opportunity. Scholars still debate the long-term consequences of these early experiences. Do they instill adaptability, resilience, and social intelligence, or do they embed fear, self-censorship, and internalized hierarchy? You feel both possibilities in your bones, senses, and heartbeat. As the evening falls and you prepare to sleep after another day of labour, instruction, and subtle performance, you lie awake considering the strange theatre of adolescence. Your sex has dictated the scripts, and yet within those lines are glimpses of freedom, creativity, and cunning. You sense the tension between destiny and choice, compliance and rebellion, survival and individuality. The world may be orchestrating your future, but your mind and subtle acts of ingenuity hint at the possibility of navigating it on your own terms. And in the quiet, as the soft hum of the fan lulls you, you realise that even in a society dominated by marriage markets, your awareness, wit, and perception are your first tools of subtle autonomy, your first weapons to influence fate. By the time you reach late adolescence, you begin to see the sharp edge of legality and inheritance looming over your life. Property and inheritance laws are no longer abstract concepts. They are rules that shape who will hold power, wealth, and influence. You notice, with a mix of fascination and anxiety, that the law itself often bends in favour of one sex. Boys in many societies automatically inherit land, livestock, or business assets. while girls may receive only dowries or symbolic items, rarely enough to secure true independence. Your very sex is a legal classification with consequences. It determines who has authority, who can own, and who must rely on the guidance or generosity of others. You begin to understand that survival isn't just about strength or skill, it's about recognition, legitimacy, and coded advantage. Historically, in medieval England, the principle of primogeniture dictated that the eldest son inherited the family estate, leaving daughters with a fraction of wealth or only marital prospects. Boys were groomed to manage land, negotiate alliances, and exercise authority. Girls were trained to support their future husbands' households. You can almost feel the weight of this system as you watch adults discuss family assets, noting the subtle differences in tone, attention, and expectation depending on who the legal heir will be. The law itself becomes a teacher, signalling to you that society values your sex differently, and that destiny is written not just by biology or skill, but by codified authority. The fringe practices make inheritance and property rules even more elaborate and sometimes bizarre. In some European regions, families would create intricate rituals or symbolic transactions to publicly validate the transfer of assets. A boy might be given a ceremonial key to the estate. A girl might receive a mock token, symbolically recognized but legally powerless. Some cultures even staged ritualized contests or assessments of skill to decide inheritance if the primary heir's competency was in doubt. Imagine yourself a teenager, witnessing or even participating in these ceremonies, aware that every gesture, decision, or stumble is scrutinized, and that your future security depends on tiny performances. The absurdity is almost comical, yet the stakes are brutally real. Peer comparison intensifies at this stage. You notice which boys or girls are receiving attention from adults regarding inheritance, dowries, or social status. Friends, cousins, and neighbours are evaluated similarly, and the subtle differences in treatment are impossible to ignore. Boys praised for competence are already being positioned as future landholders, while girls, regardless of skill, are sometimes relegated to marital alliances as their primary vehicle of social advancement. Scholars debate whether these inheritance systems were necessary for social stability and economic continuity, or whether they were mechanisms designed to entrench inequality, reinforce patriarchy, and limit social mobility. You feel both sides of the argument in your awareness, even as a young person, as you watch and learn the coded rules of property and power. Even within the family, the rules are precise. Fathers or elders teach boys how to manage finances, negotiate agreements, and maintain property. Girls are instructed in domestic economy, household management, and social diplomacy, preparing for their future roles as wives and mothers. Fringe historical accounts suggest that in some societies, girls were also trained in secret forbidden skills, like accounting, herbal remedies, or even minor legal knowledge. But these abilities were often hidden or undervalued in public, highlighting both resilience and constraint. You can feel the tension between empowerment and limitation. Knowledge is available, but social rules restrict how it can be applied. The sensory experience of these laws is subtle, but ever-present. You notice adults' gestures, facial expressions, and the objects around you: keys, ledgers, ceremonial tokens, dowry items, all signalling authority and expectation. Even meals and seating arrangements during family gatherings reinforce the hierarchy. The future inheritor sits at the head, others flank, and your sex dictates placement, privilege, and attention. Anthropologists note that such rituals were not purely symbolic. They reinforce social memory, ensuring that generations internalize their roles and expectations. You sense, without conscious thought, that power is a tangible, spatial, and procedural reality, not just a concept in adult conversation. Quirky examples abound. In some parts of medieval Europe, girls might inherit a small symbolic item, such as a handkerchief or a decorative cup, while brothers received entire estates. In parts of Africa, daughters' dowries were sometimes supplemented with playful rituals or charms to ensure that symbolic inheritance carried a blessing, if not actual wealth. You imagine holding a small token, aware that it represents not just a family gift but a society's judgment of your worth, potential, and agency. It's whimsical in its form but weighty in implication, teaching you early that even small objects can carry immense social significance. You also begin noticing the ways that property law intersects with marriage. A girl's dowry may influence her perceived social value. A boy's inheritance may determine the attractiveness of his marital prospects. This intertwining of legal, economic, and social systems ensures that your sex, appearance, skills, and comportment are constantly evaluated together, forming a complex matrix of expectation and opportunity. Scholars argue that these intersections reveal much about societal priorities. Wealth, lineage, and social cohesion often outweigh individual preference, leaving you to navigate a landscape of subtle manipulation and explicit rules. Even rebellion or negotiation carries consequences. Boys who challenge traditional inheritance rules may face family disapproval or social ostracism. Girls attempting to claim property or assert authority risk public censure or exclusion. Yet tiny acts of subversion sometimes succeed. Fringe historical cases describe clever girls who, through marriage, negotiation, or strategic alliances, accessed property and power indirectly, while some boys challenge primogeniture through demonstrated skill or social cunning. You feel the thrill of possibility in these stories, recognizing that even within rigid systems, opportunity can arise for those who pay attention and act cleverly. By the end of adolescence, you internalize the deep reality. Property and inheritance are not abstract rights. They are instruments of social control and survival. Your sex determines what you can hold, what you can influence, and how others perceive your potential. And yet, you begin to notice the subtle ways in which skill, observation, and cunning can circumvent strict rules. The ledger of expectation is heavy, yes, but it is not absolute. Small acts of insight or strategy can quietly alter the balance of opportunity. You sense that the world is a negotiation, and that survival, real, meaningful survival, requires both obedience and shrewd calculation. As you finally settle for the night, lying beneath the faint hum of a fan or the gentle rustle of curtains, you reflect, without naming it, on the strange intersection of law, inheritance, and sex-assigned destiny. Your body, mind, and future have been catalogued in subtle ways for years. You feel the invisible scales balancing privilege, risk, and compliance, the weight of expectations pressing gently but insistently. And somewhere in the quiet, you realize a truth that will follow you through the next decades. Your sex determines much of the map, but how you navigate that map, where you step, when you pause, and what risks you take, may still shape the course of your life. As you move further into young adulthood, the influence of belief and ritual becomes impossible to ignore. Religious influence and divine judgments shape nearly every decision, action, and perception of value. You realize that in this era, your sex doesn't just determine social standing, labor, or inheritance. It carries moral and spiritual weight. Boys and girls are assessed not only for physical ability or skill, but for alignment with divine expectation. In some cultures, boys are seen as inherently predisposed to leadership, valor, or public service, while girls are often framed as moral anchors, guardians of family virtue, and bearers of lineage. Even subtle misbehavior is interpreted through a religious lens, suggesting that failing to conform to your sex-assigned role is not merely socially undesirable, it is spiritually significant. Historically, in medieval Europe, church doctrine reinforced sex-based hierarchies. Boys were often expected to embody courage, public duty, and religious leadership. Girls were instructed in piety, chastity, and domestic management, with veiled warnings about the consequences of transgression. Temples, monasteries, and shrines weren't just spiritual centers, they were instruments of social education, conveying the idea that divine will favored adherence to sex-specific roles. You feel the weight of these judgments tangibly, in the tone of a priest's blessing, the structure of prayers, or the ritualized seating in a chapel. Your body, your choices, and even your thoughts are quietly evaluated for conformity to sacred expectations. Fringe religious practices add a layer of spectacle, and sometimes anxiety, to the spiritual oversight of sex roles. In parts of South Asia, young boys and girls were sometimes tested in ceremonial observances involving fasting, ritual dances, or symbolic offerings designed to reveal divine favor. Boys might endure physical trials meant to prove courage and resilience. Girls might participate in symbolic domestic or fertility rituals demonstrating compliance and social aptitude. Imagine standing in ceremonial garb, tiny and trembling, aware that the community, and perhaps the divine, is judging your worth. The blend of theatre, instruction, and moral assessment is almost absurd, yet the consequences are serious. Failure or perceived weakness can carry social stigma, diminished opportunities, or lasting reputational harm. The sensory environment reinforces the spiritual hierarchy. You notice incense smoke curling around your face, the texture of prayer mats, the cadence of chants, and the reverent hush of observers. Each sensory detail is a cue. Your body and behaviour are being catalogued in relation to religious norms. Fringe anthropologists note that in some societies, even the direction of a young girl's gaze during ritual, north, south, or toward a deity, was interpreted as a signal of compliance, virtue, or potential for marriage. You absorb this symbolism without full understanding, feeling both the weight of expectation and the strange thrill of participating in something that is simultaneously invisible and immensely consequential. You also begin to notice the subtle ways religious law intersects with social law. Boys' inheritance rights, marriage eligibility, and public authority are often legitimized by divine sanction. Girls' domestic authority and marital positioning are framed as moral duties. Scholars debate whether these religious structures were primarily intended to provide moral guidance, social cohesion, or a mechanism for maintaining gendered hierarchies. You sense the tension in daily life. Prayers, blessings, and temple attendance are intertwined with material outcomes, and compliance is both a spiritual and social strategy. Even minor gestures, a bow, a smile, a correctly timed prayer, carry layered meaning. Quirky practices abound. In some indigenous South American societies, adolescents participated in rites where boys' endurance was tested, while girls were taught ceremonial domestic tasks, both believed to predict their alignment with the gods. Some ceremonies involved symbolic objects, tiny amulets representing fertility, skill, or courage, which were then buried or displayed to signal divine favour. You can almost picture yourself handling these objects, aware that they are both playful and portentous, whimsical and serious, tangible and symbolic. The blend of ritual, morality, and social expectation is dizzying. Even your tiniest action becomes a potential measure of divine judgment. By now, peer observation amplifies pressure. Boys are praised for courage, decisiveness, or displays of religious knowledge, girls for attentiveness, grace, and ritual precision. Deviations are often quietly corrected, sometimes through reprimand, sometimes through symbolic rituals like additional prayers or community instruction. You feel the constant interplay of reward and correction, realizing that social compliance and spiritual approval are inseparable. Scholars argue that such systems reinforced social cohesion, yet they also limited agency, reinforcing rigid gender roles through spiritual as well as material authority. You experience this duality. Spiritual instruction teaches discipline and ethics while subtly constraining autonomy. You notice that the lessons extend beyond ceremony and into everyday life. Boys may be asked to lead prayers, manage community tasks, or participate in symbolic leadership trials. Girls may oversee household rituals, instruct younger siblings, or participate in community celebrations as examples of virtue. Each role reinforces the perception of divine purpose linked to sex. Fringe studies suggest that some societies even tracked individual performance during ritualized instruction, producing informal, spiritual records used to guide marital selection, inheritance, or social ranking. You sense the invisible ledger. Every gesture, expression, and act is quietly evaluated and remembered. By this stage, your awareness of the intersection between social and spiritual judgment is acute. You begin to understand that compliance with sex-assigned roles is both a survival strategy and a moral imperative in the eyes of your community. The paradox is clear. Deviation may satisfy personal curiosity or ambition, but risks spiritual and social repercussions. Adolescence in this era is not just about discovering your body and mind. It is about internalizing a cosmic expectation, one that defines morality, value, and identity simultaneously. You feel the subtle, almost tactile weight of divine scrutiny pressing on your shoulders as you navigate daily life. Even rebellion carries consequences, but small acts of defiance can also be instructive. Some boys sought hidden opportunities to explore domestic tasks or intellectual pursuits deemed inappropriate, while some girls experimented with strategic leadership or outdoor skill building. scholars debate whether such acts represent early forms of social critique, experimentation, or mere adaptation to opportunity. You can feel both possibilities. Each subtle act of defiance is a lesson in observation, risk assessment, and human ingenuity. The divine and social gaze is powerful, but not omnipotent. By the end of adolescence, religious influence has shaped not just your perception of right and wrong, but also your sense of self, value, and potential. Every choice, every act, every demonstration of skill or virtue carries moral, social, and practical weight. Yet the cracks remain. In quiet moments, observing a ritual from the edges, experimenting in secret, or simply reflecting, you sense that judgment can be both navigated and leveraged. Spiritual authority, like social law, is not absolute. Clever observation, subtle compliance, and quiet experimentation may allow you to maneuver within constraints while building opportunity. As evening falls and you lie down in the soft hum of the night, you feel a strange mix of pressure and empowerment. The weight of divine judgment is heavy but not suffocating. It shapes your life, yes, but it also teaches the subtleties of observation, compliance, and strategic action. You realize, without needing to articulate it, that religion in this era is both cage and compass. It constrains your actions while guiding your understanding of authority, morality, and social navigation. You drift towards sleep, aware that the lessons of your sex, society, and divine expectation are inseparable, preparing you for the next stage of life where appearance, ritual, and destiny will continue to intertwine. By the time you're settling into early adulthood, you start noticing that even the simplest items of daily life are heavy with meaning. Clothing as status signifier is everywhere, and what you wear tells the world everything it needs to know about your sex, social rank, and potential. You realize that your wardrobe is less about comfort and more about communication. Boys' garments are often designed to signal strength, occupation, or authority. Tunic length, sleeve width, or fabric weight can indicate readiness for work or leadership. Girls' clothing, by contrast, emphasizes grace, fertility, and domestic competence. Flowing skirts, delicate embroidery, and subtle ornamentation act as visual shorthand for social value and compliance with sex-assigned expectations. Even your body language is read through the lens of fabric, style, and fit. Historically, clothing has long functioned as both protection and proclamation. In medieval Europe, boys destined for trade or leadership wore heavier fabrics suitable for labour, travel, or combat training, while girls of marriageable age were dressed in colourful silks or linens that emphasised modesty, status, and perceived virtue. Clothes are thus not neutral. They encode messages that regulate social behaviour, reinforce hierarchy, and guide the perception of others. You feel the subtle pressure every time you don or adjust a garment, realising that fabric itself can be a tool of both empowerment and constraint. Fringe practices make attire even more theatrical. In parts of Japan during the Heian period, noble children were dressed in layers of silk robes according to age, sex, and familial rank, with even minor variations signalling courtly favour or social position. Boys might wear longer sleeves or carry ceremonial sashes. Girls' robes were colour-coded and layered to indicate maturity and marital eligibility. You imagine stepping carefully into this elaborate ensemble, aware that every fold, sash, and stitch could signal approval or scrutiny. It's both absurd and precise, a wearable system of social evaluation. You notice that clothing also serves as a social classroom. Boys learn to carry themselves in ways that emphasise strength and presence. Girls learn posture, grace, and restraint. The weight, texture, and even colour of fabric subtly influence behaviour. Heavy, durable garments for boys encourage activity and endurance, while lighter, flowing garments for girls encourage careful movement and attention to aesthetics. Scholars debate whether such practices were primarily pragmatic, adapting children to labour, climate, and safety, or symbolic conditioning social behaviour through material culture. You sense that both functions operate simultaneously, teaching compliance while shaping identity. Peer comparison adds a layer of pressure. You notice which boys are praised for wearing clothing that signals skill or status, which girls are admired for attire that communicates beauty, discipline, or refinement. Minor deviations, an ill-fitting tunic, a misaligned sash, can attract subtle disapproval, quietly affecting reputation and social leverage. Fringe anthropologists note that in some societies, children even swapped garments in playful experimentation, testing social codes or performing acts of subtle rebellion. You can imagine a secret moment of mischief. A boy draped in a girl's sash, a girl briefly wearing a boy's tunic, tiny gestures that challenge rigid norms but are also laden with risk. Even clothing for ritual occasions is carefully coded. Boys may receive ceremonial robes for coming-of-age events or labour rights, signalling competence and social legitimacy. Girls are adorned in embroidered garments for marriage-related rituals or fertility observances, communicating compliance and social value. These rituals reinforce social hierarchy while simultaneously training physical comportment. Posture, gait, and gesture are all subtly guided by fabric, style, and design. Fringe studies suggest that some communities use specially weighted fabrics to train children's endurance, movement, or social comportment, literally shaping their bodies and minds through clothing. You feel the logic, the absurdity, and the power of it all. You begin to notice that accessories too are potent communicators. Belts, sashes, jewellery, or ceremonial headpieces signal not just sex and status, but skill, readiness, and social rank. Boys might carry tools or symbolic weapons tucked into belts. Girls might wear ornamental combs or amulets signifying virtue or family prestige. Some fringe historical examples are almost whimsical. In parts of Africa, girls were sometimes adorned with shells or beads, whose arrangement indicated not only age but social value and fertility potential. Boys might wear feathered adornments to display bravery or clan loyalty. You can almost feel the tiny weight of each item on your body, a physical reminder that identity, performance, and perception are inseparable. By now, you're keenly aware of the subtle choreography imposed by clothing. Boys are encouraged to stride, stand, and gesticulate in ways that emphasize authority and readiness. Girls are taught to move gracefully, fold hands neatly, and adjust garments to maximize decorum and beauty. This isn't arbitrary. It's an early form of behavioral training embedded in daily life. Scholars debate whether this constitutes oppression or adaptation, a way of teaching social and practical skills through material culture. You experience both interpretations in real time. Each adjustment of cloth or jewellery is a lesson in expectation, and each minor misstep is a rehearsal of societal consequence. Clothing also reinforces social hierarchy beyond sex. Wealth, lineage, and access to resources are encoded visually. Finer fabrics, brighter colours, and intricate embroidery mark higher status, while coarser materials signal lower social value. Even your sex is read in context. A girl from a wealthy family might display both virtue and power, while a boy from a poor family might have authority limited by his attire, regardless of personal skill or ambition. You notice these patterns constantly, in both yourself and others, understanding that cloth is a form of silent instruction, social policing, and performance simultaneously. Quirky cultural variations continue to impress. In some pre-Columbian societies, children wore miniature adult clothing as part of social training. Boys with tiny armour or ceremonial weapons, girls with scaled-down ceremonial skirts and headdresses. The goal was explicit: teach comportment, signal social alignment, and subtly instill awareness of sex-specific roles. You can almost imagine yourself in these miniature uniforms, a blend of play and performance, learning that fabric, gesture, and public perception are inseparable from destiny. Even at your age, you sense the stakes. Mastery of clothing, posture, and display is an early lesson in social survival. By the end of this stage, you realize that clothing is far more than protection from weather or decoration. It is a social language, a system of authority, and a subtle instrument of behavioral conditioning. You feel it on your skin, in the weight of fabric, and in the ever-present awareness of observation. Even in moments of private play, the lessons of attire linger. How you move, how you sit, and how you carry yourself are constantly informed by the clothing that signals your role, worth, and sex-assigned destiny. And yet, even in this rigid framework, small acts of creativity, adjusting a sash, choosing a colour, or wearing something slightly unconventional, hint at the possibility of subtle self-expression within prescribed limits. As night falls and you prepare for sleep, the hum of life around you softens into a lullaby of expectation. You feel the pressure and potential of every fabric, adornment, and gesture you have learned to navigate. Clothing, it seems, is a quiet teacher, a mirror, and a messenger. It dictates perception, enforces hierarchy, and subtly molds behaviour. and you lie there, aware that mastery of these visual signals combined with skill, wit, and observation may one day allow you to negotiate your place in a world where sex, status, and appearance are inseparable, and where every stitch carries a whisper of fate. As you begin to navigate early adulthood more confidently, you encounter the first of society's formal milestones, rites of passage that make your sex and social role undeniably public. These ceremonies are not casual. They are highly orchestrated events designed to mark the transition from adolescence into adult responsibilities. You feel the weight of expectation before you even arrive, knowing that your body, skills, and behaviour will be assessed by the community, your family, and sometimes the divine. For boys, this might mean a display of strength, courage, or skill. For girls, a demonstration of domestic competence, grace, and social poise. These rites are both instruction and evaluation, teaching and policing, celebration and judgment. Historically, rites of passage have been central to human societies. In ancient African, Native American and Polynesian cultures, puberty and early adulthood were marked with elaborate ceremonies. Boys might be sent into the wilderness to demonstrate survival skills, undergo physical trials, or learn to hunt. Girls might be initiated into household management, fertility symbolism, and ritualized social etiquette. You feel, even as a young adult, that every gesture, posture, and performance is being noted and remembered, as if the entire community is simultaneously your audience, jury, and mentor. These rites transform adolescence into something public, tangible, and permanent in social memory. The fringe variations are almost theatrical. In some indigenous societies, adolescents were blindfolded, tasked with navigating symbolic or real obstacles, and judged not only on success but on comportment, courage, and attention to tradition. Girls might perform dances that simulate domestic labour or fertility symbolism, while boys might wrestle, run, or complete endurance trials. You can picture yourself participating, heart pounding, aware that every misstep, hesitation, or clever manoeuvre is being assessed. The absurdity is almost comic, a teenager crawling through ritualized obstacles. But the consequences are very real. Social status, reputation, and future opportunity hang in the balance. Peer and family observation amplifies the stakes. You notice which adolescents are praised, celebrated, or elevated after the ceremony, and which are quietly criticized or overlooked. Boys' successes are often marked by tangible rewards, tools, ceremonial weapons, or tokens of authority. Girls may receive ornaments, jewellery, or symbolic items signalling readiness for marriage, domestic responsibility, or social trust. Scholars debate whether these rites primarily served practical functions, preparing children for labour, social duties, and survival, or whether they were symbolic mechanisms for enforcing hierarchy, gender roles, and societal compliance. You feel both possibilities as you perform, watching, and learn the subtle choreography of approval and evaluation. Even minor details matter. Clothing, posture, tone of voice, and even gaze are scrutinized. Boys might wear specific ceremonial garments to signify readiness for adult male roles. Girls may don multi-layered robes, veils, or jewellery that simultaneously teach grace, patience, and social awareness. Fringe anthropologists report that some cultures even adjusted the weight or texture of clothing during these ceremonies to influence movement and comportment, training both body and mind to embody the expected adult role. You sense the duality. Training for real-life tasks and training for social perception are inseparable. You begin to realise that these rites also serve as public social calibration. They signal to the broader community who is prepared to assume adult responsibilities, who is worthy of trust, and who is capable of fulfilling sex-assigned duties. Boys might demonstrate leadership, physical skill, or tactical thinking. Girls might exhibit domestic competence, social diplomacy, or ritual literacy. The evaluation is continuous. Whispered notes, glances, and gestures from elders are as telling as ceremonial pronouncements. Fringe accounts describe rituals where adolescents were subtly tested on creativity, endurance, and adaptability, suggesting that flexibility within rigid roles was quietly recognized and rewarded. By participating, you learn that rites of passage are both opportunity and constraint. Success opens doors, social trust, access to marriage arrangements, or recognition within trade or household management. Failure, or even perceived weakness, can result in public admonishment, delayed responsibilities, or social stigma. You feel the subtle dance of observation and performance. Compliance demonstrates value. Ingenuity may impress if subtle, and missteps can be magnified into lasting consequences. The ceremonial structure is simultaneously protective, instructional, and controlling, shaping behavior in ways both explicit and subliminal. Sensory details embed lessons deeply. The smell of incense, the sound of drums, the texture of ceremonial garments, and the cadence of chants all reinforce the stakes. Fringe rituals in some cultures even included symbolic punishments or endurance tests, such as walking barefoot over heated surfaces or fasting during key periods, designed to demonstrate readiness, fortitude, and adherence to social norms. You sense the lessons in your body as much as in your mind. Posture, stamina, composure, and response are evaluated constantly, preparing you for both practical and social adulthood. Peer dynamics complicate the process. You notice adolescents comparing performance, gauging social capital, and noting which behaviors align with societal expectations. Boys and girls are both navigating a complex matrix of observation, imitation, and evaluation. You realize that success requires more than physical ability or skill. It demands attention to detail, perception of social cues, and careful management of impression. Fringe studies suggest that early mastery of such skills, reading subtle signals, anticipating reactions, and performing appropriately, was crucial for future negotiation of marriage, inheritance, or leadership roles. By the end of these rites, you internalize a fundamental truth. Adulthood is as much about perception and compliance as it is about skill or strength. You understand that success requires mastering the visible and invisible rules, balancing obedience with observation, skill with social acumen. Small acts of insight, subtle defiance, or strategic creativity may influence outcomes, but the structure is heavy and omnipresent. The lessons of the rite are imprinted deeply. Compliance, performance, and public awareness are not optional. They are essential for survival, reputation, and social opportunity. As the day concludes and you lie down to rest, the echoes of ceremonial chants, the weight of ceremonial garments, and the subtle gaze of elders linger in your awareness. You reflect on how these rites mark the first formal intersection of personal ability, sex-assigned expectation, and social evaluation. You understand that participation is mandatory, that the consequences are lasting, but also that observation, skill, and ingenuity can influence interpretation. In the quiet hum of evening, you realize that rites of passage are not just events. They are lessons etched into your body, mind, and social being, preparing you for a world in which your sex dictates much, but where perception and cleverness provide small avenues of agency. As you navigate early adulthood, you begin to feel a tug at the edges of your heart and body that has nothing to do with chores, education, or ritual. Sexuality and forbidden desires are slowly awakening, and in this era, they are both deeply personal and socially regulated. You notice that attraction is a minefield, a set of secret codes layered over societal expectations. Boys and girls alike are aware, if only subconsciously, that desire is not just personal, it is political. Who you glance at, who you linger near, or even whom you admire in secret can be interpreted as proof of compliance or deviance. Your very curiosity is scrutinized, shaping not only who you are but what society deems acceptable to explore. Historically, societies have approached sexuality with a blend of pragmatism, moralism, and control. In medieval Europe, for example, premarital sexual activity was heavily monitored, with strict laws and punishments for transgressions, particularly for girls. Boys might be punished less severely for similar acts, as male desire was often framed as natural and uncontrollable. You feel the inequity in subtle ways, whispered warnings, cautious glances, and ritualized instruction about the proper expression of attraction. Even minor curiosity or social missteps is framed as a potential threat to reputation, family honor, or social stability. Fringe practices make sexuality almost performative. In some Mesoamerican cultures, adolescents participated in ceremonial dances or symbolic exercises designed to teach modesty, desire management, or marital readiness. Boys might be instructed in the controlled expression of strength and dominance, while girls were guided to demonstrate restraint, grace, and subtle influence. Imagine yourself performing these rituals, aware that even a fleeting glance or playful gesture could be interpreted as evidence of moral standing, sexual propriety, or future suitability. The absurdity is palpable, ritualized instruction in desire, but the consequences are all too real. You notice that social observation magnifies the stakes. Peers, elders, and mentors are all participating in a silent evaluation. Who interacts with whom, how gestures are expressed, and whether any deviation occurs from prescribed norms. Boys are praised for demonstrating controlled assertiveness, girls for showing subtlety, composure, and social acumen. Deviations can result in teasing, gossip, or more formal reprimands. Scholars debate whether these restrictions were designed primarily to protect young people, to preserve social order, or to control female reproductive power. You feel the tension in every moment of social interaction, recognizing that even private feelings are influenced by public expectation. Physical markers of sexuality are also interpreted as social signals. Boys developing strength, voice, or physical prowess are assumed ready for adult responsibility. Girls showing curves or secondary sexual characteristics are seen as ripe for marriage or domestic labour. Fringe practices in some societies emphasised observation of these changes. In parts of Polynesia, for example, elders would subtly evaluate adolescent posture, gait, and bearing to gauge readiness for social roles tied to sex and reproduction. You feel the invasive weight of this scrutiny, realising that your body has become a ledger that charts not only biological development, but social valuation. Romantic experimentation is simultaneously thrilling and dangerous. You notice subtle ways that desire is expressed, secret notes, lingering glances, or coded gestures, each carrying risk and reward. Boys and girls must negotiate attraction within a rigid framework of propriety, where deviation is socially sanctioned and compliance is rewarded. Anthropologists have noted that these courtship codes often included playful, ritualized behaviors that allowed safe expression of desire while maintaining public order. You begin to understand that sexuality is not merely a biological impulse here. It is a social negotiation, a series of performances that must be carefully managed. Even secret knowledge can become a tool. Some adolescents learn about forbidden or socially restricted behaviors through whispered lessons, coded conversation, or observation of older peers. Boys may learn techniques of charm or negotiation. Girls may discover subtle strategies to influence suitors or assert social authority. Fringe accounts from medieval Europe describe hidden spaces where girls practiced reading or learned herbs to enhance social influence, including subtle aspects of sexual health. You imagine these secret lessons as both empowering and dangerous, a private arsenal of skills that could be deployed to navigate the rigid structures surrounding desire. The intersection of sexuality and marriage is particularly significant. For girls, perceived desirability and the ability to manage social expectations directly influence marital prospects. For boys, demonstration of skill, reputation, and controlled assertiveness affects eligibility. Scholars debate whether these systems functioned primarily as social protection mechanisms or as a form of gendered control that reinforced patriarchal hierarchies. You sense the complexity firsthand. Sexual knowledge, behaviour, and perception are tightly intertwined with social, legal, and familial structures, creating a dense web of expectation that must be navigated carefully. You notice that even minor acts of rebellion carry lessons. A secret smile, a lingering glance, or playful interaction can signal autonomy, cunning, or creativity. But miscalculation risks punishment or social marginalization. Some adolescents strategically manipulate appearances, gestures, and language to test boundaries without crossing overtly into transgression. Fringe practices in some indigenous cultures formalize these behaviors as socially sanctioned symbolic games of desire. Mock flirtations, choreographed dances, or coded storytelling exercises that allowed safe exploration of sexual and social strategy. You feel both exhilaration and fear, aware that your choices have subtle but lasting consequences. By the end of adolescence, sexuality is no longer simply a private experience. It is an instrument, a negotiation, and a metric for social valuation. Your body, gestures, and desires are catalogued alongside labour, skill, and ritual compliance, forming an intricate map of your place in society. Even fleeting acts, curiosity, attraction, or playful defiance carry consequences that extend beyond the personal. You begin to understand that desire is inseparable from destiny. Managing it, observing its social codings, and sometimes manipulating perception is essential to navigating this world. As night falls, and the soft hum of evening settles around you, you lie awake feeling the weight of desire, expectation and caution all at once. You recognise that sexuality in this era is neither purely personal nor entirely free. It is a careful negotiation between biology, social hierarchy, and the subtle pressures of compliance. And yet, even in this complex regulated system, there is room for observation, ingenuity, and strategy. You drift towards sleep, aware that desire is not just feeling, it is a tool, a mirror, and sometimes a weapon, essential for understanding your role, your power, and your survival in a world where sex literally decides your fate. As you settle into early adulthood, you begin to see the invisible walls that govern power and voice. Political power and exclusion are inextricably tied to your sex, and suddenly, the world feels both immense and limited at the same time. You notice that some doors, council chambers, guild meetings, or local assemblies are literally closed to you if you are female, while males are expected to speak, vote, and lead. Even informal influence is restricted. Girls might advise in whispers, guide household decisions, or manage behind-the-scenes negotiations, but their authority is never codified or publicly recognized. You feel the subtle oppression of this structure, like air pressing down invisibly yet palpably, teaching you the stark lesson that society's rules are not just suggestions, they are enforced hierarchies rooted in sex. Historically, political exclusion is a universal pattern. In classical Athens, only male citizens could participate in the assembly, debate law, or hold office, while women were confined to the domestic sphere and ceremonial roles. In other civilizations, like parts of medieval Europe and China, the principle was similar. Public governance was considered the exclusive domain of men, while women wielded influence indirectly, often through family or religious authority. You feel, even as a young adult, that your sex literally dictates which parts of the public world you may inhabit, which voices are heard, and which are silenced. The realization is both humbling and infuriating. Fringe examples make the limits even stranger. In some Polynesian societies, women could wield temporary authority during specific ritual periods, such as managing ceremonies or adjudicating disputes while men were absent. Boys, in contrast, had continual access to formal political structures. You imagine the oddity of this system. Fleeting empowerment juxtaposed against lifelong exclusion. Ceremonial participation as both reward and reminder of structural inequality. The theatricality highlights the absurd yet rigid logic of sex-based governance, teaching you that influence is rarely absolute. It is conditional, symbolic, and often precarious. You notice how law intersects with politics to reinforce exclusion. Even when women possessed property, wealth, or familial influence, their legal and political agency remained constrained. Boys and men could propose legislation, enforce communal decisions, and act as public representatives. Girls and women were expected to shape outcomes only indirectly, through domestic, ceremonial, or covert channels. Scholars debate whether this system was primarily pragmatic, designed to ensure social cohesion, or intentionally hierarchical, limiting female influence to protect male dominance. You feel the tension firsthand, seeing peers rewarded for visibility and voice while others are subtly constrained, learning to navigate a world where power is not equally distributed. Economic participation is closely tied to political exclusion. Boys and men who control wealth, property, or trade networks naturally gain influence, reinforcing the perception that their opinions are more valuable in public governance. Girls and women, even when competent or wealthy, often see their influence diminished, measured primarily by indirect social connections or marital alliances. Fringe historical accounts describe creative strategies women employed to exercise authority, such as sponsoring trade expeditions, controlling household finances, or serving as trusted intermediaries in negotiations. You notice the ingenuity of these maneuvers, realizing that influence is not always about formal access. It can be earned through strategy, observation, and subtle social skill. Peer dynamics complicate matters further. Boys are trained in debate, negotiation, and strategic action, developing social networks that cement future authority. Girls are trained in diplomacy, discretion, and negotiation within prescribed domestic or ceremonial spheres. You start to understand that political power is learned long before formal participation. It is rehearsed in childhood games, household decision-making, and ritualized observation. Fringe anthropologists note that these early experiences often shaped later skill in leadership or resistance, suggesting that social acumen could compensate for formal exclusion. You feel the tension. Visibility confers advantage, invisibility requires cunning, and both are shaped by your sex. Public ritual reinforces political hierarchy. In many cultures, boys participate in councils, public assemblies, or ceremonial governance training, often observed and evaluated by elders. Girls might participate in rituals symbolizing domestic authority, fertility, or moral guidance, always indirect in their influence. Fringe societies took this further. In some African communities, women could publicly challenge minor decisions during festivals or ritualized disputes, but only under strict ceremonial conditions. You can imagine the subtle thrill of these moments, testing boundaries while respecting rules, learning that influence is less about overt access and more about reading social and symbolic codes. You begin to recognize patterns in reward and punishment. Boys who demonstrate assertiveness, intelligence, or strategic skill are praised and gradually introduced to formal roles of influence. Girls who exhibit similar talents may be privately acknowledged but rarely given public recognition. Deviations from expected roles, assertive girls, timid boys, often provoke social friction, whispers, or formal admonishment. Scholars debate whether these restrictions stifled talent or whether societies relied on a distributed model of authority, where influence was partitioned across sex-assigned spheres. You feel both interpretations as you navigate daily interactions, noting which behaviours are rewarded, tolerated, or subtly censured. Cultural symbols of authority reinforce exclusion. Boys might wear ceremonial garb, carry insignia of office, or be seated prominently in assemblies. Girls' symbolic markers, such as ceremonial jewellery or specific hairstyles, signal social status and domestic competence, but rarely confer decision-making authority. Fringe accounts describe cases where young women temporarily assumed symbolic authority during ritual events or absences of male leaders, creating fleeting spaces for agency that illuminate both flexibility and rigidity in the system. You imagine these moments as both tantalizing and frustrating, small glimpses of possibility within a highly constrained world. By the end of this stage, you internalize a fundamental truth. Political power is not evenly distributed, and your sex determines the formal structures you may enter. Yet the cracks in this system are visible. Clever observation, strategic alliances, and subtle influence can create pathways of impact even within constraints. You realize that authority is not simply granted. It is performed, negotiated, and sometimes subverted. Understanding these dynamics becomes as important as physical skill, labour competency, or ritual participation. The world is a chessboard, and you are learning to play, even if some squares are barred by birthright. As night descends and the soft hum of the environment lulls you towards sleep, you lie reflecting on the intersection of sex, social structure, and political agency. You understand that exclusion is pervasive yet not absolute, that authority is codified, but cleverness, observation, and strategic action can carve space for influence. You sense that navigating this world requires both compliance and ingenuity, obedience and subtle rebellion. And as you drift into dreams, the weight of expectation and the glimmer of possibility intertwine, teaching you that power is always conditional, often invisible, but never entirely inaccessible. As adulthood solidifies, your body and role are increasingly called upon in ways that test endurance, skill, and obedience. Military drafts and physical trials become unavoidable markers of sex-assigned destiny, particularly for boys. You notice that your muscles, reflexes, and stamina are scrutinized not only by elders, but by the larger social network, each movement evaluated as evidence of readiness to protect, fight, or labor. Boys may be conscripted for combat or defense, often with little choice, while girls are expected to perform supportive labor, manage households, and ensure the continuity of the community. The divide is stark. Your sex literally determines which risks you must bear, and your survival increasingly depends on compliance, skill, and social perception. Historically, military drafts were highly sex-specific. In Sparta, male children, once deemed strong enough, were enrolled in the agoj, a rigorous training program that combined combat instruction, survival exercises, and social indoctrination. Girls, meanwhile, trained in domestic skills, health, and physical conditioning for childbearing. sometimes including modest athletics to ensure strength and endurance. You can feel the weight of expectation pressing into your daily life. Survival is not merely a question of biology or instinct, but of being prepared physically and socially for your assigned obligations. Fringe practices make this training almost theatrical. In some Mesoamerican cultures, adolescent boys were subjected to ritualized combat simulations involving symbolic weapons, timed challenges, and endurance tasks. Girls, meanwhile, participated in ritualized domestic competitions and symbolic fertility demonstrations. Imagine the odd combination of ceremony, education, and subtle social policing. Every swing of a wooden sword, every meticulously woven thread is both a test and a public declaration of compliance. You sense that these trials are simultaneously practical, symbolic, and evaluative, each action catalogued in the invisible ledger of destiny. Peer comparison adds to the pressure. Boys are measured against each other in displays of strength, courage, and skill. Girls are compared in composure, domestic competence, and social grace. Deviations from expected performance, hesitation in a trial, imperfect weaving, or mismanaged domestic exercise can elicit subtle reprimands or public commentary. Scholars debate whether these systems were primarily pragmatic, ensuring community survival, or whether they function to reinforce rigid hierarchies and maintain gendered control. You feel both interpretations as you navigate these challenges, noticing how compliance earns praise while minor deviations can shadow your social evaluation. Physical training itself is designed to instill endurance and obedience. Boys may be tasked with running long distances, carrying heavy loads, or practicing combat under supervision. Girls' exercises might include long hours of sewing, cooking, or performing domestic rituals under observation, sometimes combined with physical conditioning to ensure resilience for childbirth and labour. Fringe accounts describe methods that blur instruction and ritual, weighted garments, timed tasks, and competitive exercises that tested not only skill, but composure and adaptability. You sense that every movement, every measured effort, is both practical training and a demonstration of obedience, preparing your body and mind for the socially prescribed path. The psychological dimension is equally significant. Survival in these trials requires more than physical skill. It demands discipline, patience, awareness, and subtle social intelligence. Boys are expected to anticipate commands, read social cues, and demonstrate leadership under stress. Girls must navigate observation, manage symbolic performance, and maintain composure. Anthropologists note that these early trials shape not only physical competency, but lifelong strategies for social negotiation, compliance, and subtle influence. You feel this in your body. Each trial reinforces the rules, while simultaneously teaching you how to observe, adapt, and survive. You notice that ceremonial elements are often intertwined with practical instruction. Boys might carry symbolic weapons, wear specific garments, or participate in ritualized movements designed to simulate battle scenarios. Girls' activities might include symbolic cooking, weaving, or ritualized tasks that mimic adult responsibilities, often performed under the observation of elders. Fringe practices sometimes elevated minor skill demonstrations into public spectacle. Boys tested for courage by climbing high structures, girls for precision by completing intricate domestic tasks under scrutiny. These exercises are simultaneously instructional, evaluative, and performative, underscoring the inseparability of social expectation and practical preparation. Economic and social consequences intersect with physical trials. Boys who excel may earn early recognition, privileges or opportunities in trade, leadership or military roles. Girls who demonstrate skill, patience, and composure may secure social approval, favourable marriage prospects, or household authority. Even minor errors are catalogued, influencing future evaluation and opportunity. Scholars debate whether these evaluations primarily aim to optimize social and survival outcomes, or to entrench hierarchies and gender norms. You feel the duality. Preparation for real-world survival intertwined with training in social compliance and observation. The pressure is constant and multidimensional. Boys may be required to endure hardship as a test of character, girls as a demonstration of competence and composure. Deviations may provoke correction, ridicule, or public admonishment. Fringe anthropologists note that in some societies, subtle acts of ingenuity or hidden rebellion during these trials were quietly observed and sometimes rewarded. suggesting that adaptability and cunning were recognised even within strict gendered hierarchies. You feel the tension. Obedience is essential, but observation, subtle creativity, and awareness provide small but crucial opportunities to navigate the system effectively. By the end of this stage, you internalise the reality. Your sex dictates both the risks you will face and the skills you must master. Survival and success are inextricably linked to compliance with socially prescribed roles, mastery of physical and symbolic tasks, and acute observation of social cues. Yet subtle rebellion, clever adaptation, and quiet initiative remain possible, hinting that even within rigid constraints, agency exists. You realise that the world is a constant balancing act. Endurance, skill, social acumen, and observation combine to determine both immediate survival and long-term opportunity. As night falls, and the faint hum of a fan or distant voices fills your awareness, you lie reflecting on the intertwining of sex, duty, and physical performance. You feel the weight of expectation pressing on your shoulders, the thrill of skill and endurance testing your limits, and the subtle awareness that strategy and observation are as vital as raw strength. Physical trials are not merely exercises, they are life lessons, social codifications, and moral tests rolled into one. And as you drift towards sleep, you sense that your body, mind, and perceptiveness are all instruments in the ongoing negotiation of fate, each carefully measured against the standards of an era where sex decides everything. By the time you reach the midpoint of young adulthood, you start noticing how deeply your sex determines what you can earn, create, and even aspire to. Economic opportunities are structured, almost preordained, according to whether you are male or female. You observe the market and workplace as an invisible map, one lane clearly reserved for boys, the other for girls, each filled with different expectations, rewards, and risks. Boys are often trained in trades, crafts, or professions that provide social visibility, autonomy, and the ability to accumulate wealth. Girls, by contrast, are guided toward domestic labour, small-scale trade, or support roles, essential for family survival but rarely recognised publicly or financially rewarded to the same extent. Even ambition is filtered through sex, shaping not only what you do, but what you believe you can achieve. Historically, in medieval Europe, guild membership and professional training were primarily male privileges. Boys apprenticed in blacksmithing, carpentry, or commerce could eventually hold property, join councils, or earn wages that contributed directly to personal and family wealth. Girls' labour, though critical, managing households, producing textiles, or assisting in family shops, was largely unpaid or undervalued, reinforcing economic dependency and limiting social mobility. You notice how deeply this structure shapes everyday life, even seemingly small choices, what to learn, whom to work with, and how to present yourself, affect both opportunity and survival. Fringe practices highlight how societies creatively reinforced these economic divisions. In some parts of India, girls were trained in spinning and weaving not just for domestic consumption, but as a means of earning supplemental family income, while boys were apprenticed to trades that offered potential for public authority or wealth accumulation. In medieval Japan, some girls participated in household trade, producing textiles that were sold in markets, yet these earnings rarely granted them independent control or legal recognition. You can imagine yourself working under supervision, aware that skill and labour are constantly observed, catalogued, and interpreted through the lens of sex, shaping both present recognition and future prospects. You notice that access to economic opportunity is often mediated by family, caste, or social rank. Boys with connections or inherited property are poised to leverage skill into wealth, while girls, even if talented, must navigate patriarchal constraints, marriage arrangements, or familial oversight. Scholars debate whether these systems were designed primarily for practical survival, ensuring continuity of labour and social stability, or whether they function to entrench gender inequality, concentrating wealth and decision-making in male hands. You feel the tension firsthand. Competence alone rarely guarantees access. Knowledge of the rules, social perception, and subtle compliance are equally essential. Even minor acts can influence economic trajectories. Boys who demonstrate skill, reliability, and social savvy may gain apprenticeships, contracts, or early recognition within trade networks. Girls who excel in domestic craft, negotiation, or household management may increase their family's prosperity, enhance their social reputation, or improve marital prospects. Fringe anthropologists note that in some societies, subtle deviations or ingenuity, like a girl secretly mastering market skills or a boy innovating a new craft technique, could disrupt social expectations, sometimes benefiting the individual but also risking censure. You sense the constant negotiation. Labour, skill, and social perception are inseparable in shaping opportunity. The daily rhythm of work reinforces these divisions. Boys' labour often includes physical tasks, trade-specific skills, or community-based projects that yield measurable rewards, coins, goods, or recognition. Girls' labour is domestic, repetitive, and socially framed. Cooking, weaving, childcare, and household management may be observed and praised but rarely monetarily rewarded. Fringe practices sometimes introduced playful elements. Boys participating in mock markets or craft competitions, girls engaging in domestic contests with symbolic or minor economic stakes. These experiences teach lessons about labour, skill, and social evaluation, blending education, ritual, and subtle social conditioning. You notice that economic opportunity also intersects with physical and social expectation. Boys' bodies are trained for labour-intensive work, endurance, and public visibility. Girls' bodies are trained for domestic skill, composure, and reproductive readiness. This isn't purely practical, it's symbolic. Skill, appearance, and social perception all influence opportunity. Scholars debate whether these early labour divisions enhance survival efficiency or reinforced patriarchal control. You experience both. The logic of division is clear, but the inequity is palpable, shaping how you navigate the world and what you dare to aspire toward. Social networking further affects opportunity. Boys cultivate relationships with mentors, apprenticeships, or trade partners, gaining access to knowledge and resources. Girls develop networks within households, ceremonial circles, or extended kin, learning influence without formal recognition. Fringe examples illustrate clever navigation. Some women in medieval Europe or Asia leveraged household control, textile skills, or market acumen to gain wealth or indirect authority, circumventing formal exclusion. You notice that subtle observation, negotiation, and skill application are often as crucial as formal training in determining economic outcomes. The stakes are both practical and psychological. Success in assigned labour roles builds reputation, social approval, and future security. Failure can lead to diminished marriage prospects, family disapproval, or social marginalisation. Fringe historical accounts describe subtle forms of assessment, elders noting precision, initiative, and adherence to task, influencing future resource allocation or marital evaluation. You feel the pressure as a combination of internalized expectation and external observation, understanding that survival, social mobility, and influence are tightly interwoven with the work you perform and how it is perceived. By the end of this stage, you understand the profound relationship between sex and economic opportunity. Your labour, skill, and social awareness are constantly evaluated, shaping both present recognition and long-term prospects. You realise that while sex dictates initial access and opportunity, careful observation, ingenuity, and subtle negotiation can create unexpected advantages within prescribed roles. Survival and success require more than raw skill. They demand strategic engagement with the social and economic codes of your world. As evening falls and you settle into rest, the lessons of labour, observation, and social evaluation linger in your body and mind. You feel the pressure and potential of every task, every gesture, and every observed interaction. Economic opportunity is never purely individual. It is structured by sex, social hierarchy, and public perception. Yet, within the constraints, there is space for strategy, subtle defiance, and personal agency. You drift towards sleep, aware that survival, prosperity, and influence in this era are lessons taught as much by observation and compliance as by skill and effort, a constant negotiation where your sex literally decides the possibilities before you. As you continue navigating adulthood, you start realizing that your body, health, and even the care you receive are subtly, but powerfully shaped by your sex. Health, medicine, and bodily control are not neutral, and your survival depends on more than just skill or observation. Boys and men are often prioritized in access to medical treatment, nutrition, or protection during illness, reflecting societal investment in public labor, defense, and inheritance. Girls and women, while essential to family survival and reproduction, frequently experience neglect, limited access to remedies, or treatments filtered through social expectation. You feel this disparity in subtle ways: slightly smaller portions of medicine, careful observation of your diet, or whispered instructions on what to avoid. Even your body becomes a site of societal control, monitored, evaluated, and sometimes manipulated according to rigid gender norms. Historically, the difference in medical attention and perception of vulnerability is well documented. In ancient Rome, male infants were sometimes given priority in nourishment and care, while female infants received less attention, reflecting broader societal investment in male survival for military, economic, and political purposes. In medieval Europe, women's access to healthcare, especially reproductive healthcare, was constrained by social, religious, and economic factors, often forcing them to rely on herbal remedies or midwives rather than formally trained physicians. You notice that these patterns are subtle but pervasive. Your well-being is always mediated through the lens of social and sex-based expectation. Fringe practices make bodily control even more remarkable and sometimes alarming. In some parts of Africa and Asia, adolescents were subjected to ritualized health tests tied to sex roles. Boys might endure exercises, endurance trials, or herbal tonics intended to strengthen strength, virility, or endurance. Girls might receive fertility-related tonics, massages, or body wraps designed to shape posture, appearance, or reproductive capacity. Imagine lying quietly while these rituals are performed, feeling the dual pressure of observation and expectation. Your body as both a laboratory and a ledger of destiny. The absurdity is palpable, yet the consequences are very real. These interventions can determine not only social perception, but actual survival and reproductive potential. Nutrition is similarly stratified. Boys often receive higher protein diets or richer foods, designed to encourage physical growth, stamina, and labour readiness. Girls are offered more modest portions or foods believed to promote beauty, patience, and reproductive health. Fringe historical accounts describe some cultures providing boys with meat-heavy rations, while girls were given specific herbal preparations believed to shape temperament or fertility. You notice the subtle differences in taste, texture, and portion size, internalizing the lesson that the body itself is a canvas for social engineering. Even the simplest sip of water or morsel of food carries meaning beyond nourishment. Peer and adult observation amplifies pressure on bodily control. Boys are expected to demonstrate strength, agility, and endurance. Girls are expected to exhibit composure, grace, and reproductive readiness. Minor failures, clumsiness in a task, an illness that delays training, or a subtle misstep in posture, are noted and remembered, influencing social standing, labour expectations, and potential marital or inheritance opportunities. Scholars debate whether this gendered approach to health was primarily pragmatic, intended to maximise survival and productivity, or whether it reinforced systemic inequality and control over female bodies. You feel both interpretations in your daily life, as the stakes are both practical and symbolic. Medical knowledge itself is filtered through sex. Boys often have access to physicians, tutors in physical care, or mentors who teach preventive strategies. Girls' knowledge is largely domestic or secretive, passed from mothers or older women in the household. Fringe practices sometimes encourage clandestine skill acquisition. Girls might learn herbal medicine, childbirth techniques, or subtle forms of physical conditioning in secret, ensuring survival and agency within a constrained framework. You imagine yourself absorbing these lessons quietly, aware that knowledge is power, but that access is deliberately uneven, and that your body and health are always, in some sense, under social jurisdiction. Physical labour and risk intersect with health management. Boys are exposed to endurance training, combat simulations, and labour-intensive tasks that improve resilience, but also carry injury risk. Girls' tasks emphasise precision, composure, and reproductive preparedness, often limiting exposure to physical danger, but still requiring endurance. Scholars debate whether these divisions were adaptive for survival or deliberately reinforcing hierarchies. You feel the truth in both. Your body is trained, observed, and occasionally manipulated to optimize social value, with consequences for survival, status, and future opportunity. Even the seemingly mundane tasks, carrying water, weaving cloth, or preparing food, have an underlying logic connected to health, labour, and compliance. Rituals often reinforce bodily control. Boys may participate in endurance challenges or physical trials tied to social recognition and marital eligibility. Girls may engage in ceremonies that shape posture, grace, and fertility perception. Fringe historical examples show extreme measures: herbal tonics, body-shaping wraps, or ceremonial diets designed to influence physical development. Imagine lying under the scrutiny of ritual observers while your body is evaluated, nurtured, and subtly moulded. Every heartbeat, every posture adjustment, every sip or bite is a lesson in compliance, survival, and strategic adaptation. By the end of this stage, you understand that your body is not simply biological. It is a social, economic, and moral instrument. Survival, opportunity, and social recognition are mediated through health, strength, and physical comportment, all evaluated in relation to your sex. Even minor acts of observation, self-care, or skillful adaptation can influence long-term outcomes. Fringe practices remind you that the body can be both constrained and leveraged. Subtle ingenuity, attention to ritual, and careful compliance can open pathways otherwise closed. You feel a deep kinesthetic awareness of these dynamics in your posture, strength, and daily habits. As evening falls and the soft hum of the world surrounds you, you lie quietly reflecting on the intersection of health, medicine, and bodily control. Your body has been observed, tested, and subtly shaped since birth, and you now understand that it continues to serve as a canvas for societal expectation, ritual compliance, and personal strategy. Yet even within these constraints, agency remains. Careful observation, knowledge, and small acts of ingenuity allow you to navigate, negotiate, and sometimes subtly subvert the system. And as you drift towards sleep, the lesson is clear. Survival and success are not only matters of skill or labour, they are tied inextricably to the careful management and understanding of your body, your health, and your sex-assigned destiny. By now, you begin to sense the subtle ways society monitors your reputation. Social honour and reputation are tightly bound to your sex, and in this era, a misstep can ripple across decades. You notice that your words, gestures, and even your expression are constantly evaluated. Boys are expected to demonstrate courage, loyalty, and honour in public and private actions. Girls are expected to show obedience, virtue, and discretion. A single comment, a poorly timed smile, or a perceived lapse in conduct can affect marriage prospects, social standing, and even family prestige. You feel the invisible ledger updating with each act, teaching that survival is not merely physical, it is relational, symbolic, and performative. Historically, social honour dictated opportunities, alliances, and survival. In medieval Europe, a boy accused of cowardice could see his social mobility curtailed, while a girl perceived as promiscuous might have her marriage prospects severely limited. In feudal Japan, honour extended to entire families, with a single misstep affecting inheritance, arranged marriages, and community standing. You begin to understand that reputation is both a protective and constraining force. It can open doors, secure alliances, and safeguard survival, but it is fragile and constantly under scrutiny. Fringe cultural practices amplify the stakes of reputation. In parts of Africa, young men might participate in public duels or endurance contests to prove bravery, while young women performed public rituals or domestic demonstrations to show skill and virtue. Some societies incorporated symbolic punishment for lapses, such as temporary exclusion from communal gatherings, public warnings, or ritualized correction ceremonies. Imagine participating in these rituals, acutely aware that every smile, posture, or gesture is being interpreted by a network of peers and elders. The absurdity is palpable, the theatre of social evaluation. But the consequences are very real, and survival often depends on mastering this delicate choreography. Peer networks serve as both reinforcement and surveillance. Boys compare bravery, generosity, and skill. Girls evaluate composure, tact, and adherence to norms. Gossip, teasing, and subtle recognition function as both social lubricant and regulatory mechanism. Scholars debate whether these social pressures primarily fostered cohesion, transmitted cultural norms, or reinforced hierarchies and inequality. You feel both interpretations as you navigate the delicate balance of compliance, observation, and subtle strategic action. Each interaction is an informal test, teaching lessons in influence, perception, and prudence. economic and marital prospects are closely tied to reputation. Boys demonstrating competence, courage, and adherence to societal norms gain access to trade, leadership roles, or desirable alliances. Girls showing virtue, discretion, and domestic skill become attractive candidates for advantageous marriages. Fringe historical accounts reveal subtle methods of evaluation. Elders or peers might note efficiency in chores, attentiveness to social rules, or skill in ceremonial practice. These observations become part of a community memory that influences opportunities for years. You notice that your every small act is a potential data point in this social ledger. Even minor deviations carry risk. Boys who fail to demonstrate courage, generosity, or loyalty may face ridicule, loss of status, or reduced inheritance prospects. Girls who show impulsiveness, carelessness, or defiance may be quietly reprimanded, socially sidelined, or, in extreme cases, formally punished. You understand that compliance is both strategy and survival. It maintains your place within the community and safeguards future opportunities. Yet subtle acts of ingenuity, negotiation, or carefully timed defiance can be quietly rewarded, creating spaces for agency even in a rigid system. Ceremonial and ritualized performances reinforce reputation. Boys participate in displays of martial skill, strategic thinking, or leadership under observation. Girls may demonstrate household management, ritual knowledge, or moral comportment. Fringe examples include public storytelling, dance, or symbolic competitions designed to evaluate adherence to norms while allowing subtle observation of initiative, intelligence, and adaptability. You sense that the ceremonial and practical merge here. Reputation is earned through both visible skill and careful social navigation. Every movement, glance, and gesture is catalogued, teaching lessons about observation, compliance, and subtle influence. Family dynamics heavily influence the construction of social honour. Fathers, mothers, and elders act as both guides and evaluators, subtly rewarding behaviour aligned with expectations and discouraging deviation. Boys may be praised for responsible labour, courage in play or work, and proper engagement with mentors. Girls may be praised for domestic skill, decorum, and discretion. Fringe historical accounts suggest families sometimes exaggerated praise or criticism to influence marital or social outcomes, subtly shaping perception beyond immediate observation. You notice that your family's attention is rarely neutral. Every act is interpreted, recorded, and leveraged. Social honour also intersects with spiritual and religious evaluation. Boys' courage and loyalty are often tied to moral or divine approval. Girls' virtue, obedience, and composure are framed as moral imperatives. Scholars debate whether this conflation of morality, social standing, and sex-specific roles primarily served practical or ideological purposes. You experience it firsthand. Even personal feelings, minor acts of curiosity or private behaviour, are interpreted in ways that reflect on your honour, your family, and your social trajectory. The pressure is omnipresent, subtle, and unyielding, teaching vigilance, self-control, and strategic presentation. By the end of this stage, you internalize a fundamental truth. Reputation is not simply social, it is a form of survival, currency, and leverage. Your sex shapes both the opportunities available and the ways they must be navigated. Small acts, careful observation, subtle defiance, strategic compliance can influence outcomes, but the stakes are constant. Reputation is fragile, constantly updated, and influential in every social, economic, and ceremonial interaction. You realize that survival in this era is not just physical or skill-based. It is relational, performative, and continuously negotiated. As night descends and the soft hum of evening envelops your senses, you lie reflecting on the intertwining forces of sex, social perception, and personal agency. Reputation is simultaneously cage, guide, and currency. It constrains, directs, and opens doors. You understand that mastering the delicate interplay of behaviour, observation, and subtle influence is essential to survival. And as you drift into sleep, you feel the invisible ledger of honour, the pressure of expectation, and the opportunities for clever navigation converging in your awareness, teaching that social survival is as essential and as fragile as life itself. As you progress into adulthood, you begin to see that your personal identity is constantly weighed against societal expectation. Marriage and sexual politics are no longer distant concepts. They are active forces shaping every relationship, alliance, and even thought. You notice that marriage isn't just about love or companionship. It is a transaction, a negotiation of social, economic, and political value, tightly governed by sex. Boys are expected to demonstrate skill, resourcefulness, and status, proving they can provide protection, labour, and influence. Girls are trained to display virtue, domestic competence, and social grace, signalling readiness to manage households and alliances. Every glance, gesture, and word carries hidden weight, influencing not just personal outcomes, but family honour and social networks. Historically, arranged marriages were a global norm. In medieval Europe, girls were often married as early as their mid-teens to secure alliances, consolidate wealth, or strengthen social ties, while boys were evaluated for their capacity to support a family and manage property. In parts of India and China, elaborate dowry and bride price systems formalised the economic and social negotiation, ensuring that marriage was as much about wealth and status as about companionship. You begin to see that your sex not only dictates the rules of the game, but also the metrics by which success, desirability, and survival are measured. Fringe practices make the system both absurd and ritualistic. In some African societies, young women participated in public displays of skill, fertility, or composure, while young men engaged in mock competitions to demonstrate strength, wisdom, or generosity. Some communities even staged subtle auditions of social intelligence. Boys might be observed for negotiation skills and courage, girls for patience, cleverness, and the ability to manage relational dynamics. You imagine participating in these events, heart-pounding, aware that every micro-expression or minor lapse could have long-term consequences. The theatre of evaluation is intense, the stakes social, economic, and psychological. Peer networks magnify the scrutiny. Friends, cousins, and rivals all observe behaviour, subtly reinforcing the social ledger of attractiveness, competence, and worth. Boys' gestures of confidence, resourcefulness, or leadership are noted and compared. Girls' domestic skill, composure, and decorum are evaluated continuously. Minor errors, awkward interaction, overly assertive behaviour in girls or hesitation in boys can reverberate through social memory, influencing future alliances, opportunities, and even informal status. Scholars debate whether these pressures primarily reinforce social cohesion, survival strategies, or hierarchical inequality. You experience both truths. The social mechanisms maintain order but limit freedom, compelling careful observation, calculation, and strategic interaction. Economic considerations intersect with marriage politics. Boys who control land, property, or trade are deemed desirable. Girls' dowries, reputation, and skill determine their value. Fringe historical accounts describe creative strategies women employed to influence outcomes, secretly managing household wealth, cultivating social networks, or leveraging ritual knowledge to subtly manipulate negotiations. Boys, too, could negotiate through displays of skill, generosity, or strategic alliances. You begin to understand that marriage is not simply a private or romantic act. It is a complex negotiation that requires attention, awareness, and clever calculation to navigate successfully. Even minor deviations carry consequences. Girls who assert independence or flirt with social rebellion may face exclusion, delayed marriage prospects, or familial censure. Boys who fail to demonstrate competence, courage, or strategic thinking risk reduced social standing, diminished alliances, or criticism from elders. The subtle dance of compliance and clever negotiation becomes essential. The world is watching, and each action is a performance. Fringe anthropological evidence suggests that some adolescents leveraged ritual loopholes or staged tests to demonstrate skill or virtue while quietly bending social norms. You sense that subtle ingenuity can create opportunities even within a rigid structure. Rituals reinforce the intertwining of sexuality, marriage, and social evaluation. Boys might participate in endurance trials, hunting simulations, or strategic competitions to display readiness for responsibility. Girls might perform domestic contests, ritual dances, or fertility observances. Fringe practices sometimes elevated minor skill demonstrations into major communal performances, highlighting the interdependence of perception, performance, and social evaluation. You notice that success in these arenas influences reputation, future opportunity, and even inheritance indirectly. Performance is never purely symbolic. It has material, social, and psychological consequences that shape the trajectory of your life. Religion and morality intersect with marriage politics. Boys are instructed to demonstrate loyalty, courage, and moral rectitude. Girls are guided to display virtue, composure, and obedience. Scholars debate whether these expectations primarily enforce societal stability, ensure survival, or maintain patriarchal hierarchies. You sense the tension firsthand. Personal desire is constrained by social and moral codes, and compliance is often rewarded while deviation carries risk. Even subtle behaviours, choosing to speak first, sitting in a certain place, or expressing desire, can have consequences in the complex moral calculus of your community. The sensory experience of this era further reinforces expectations. Clothing, posture, tone of voice, and ritualized gestures all communicate status, virtue, or readiness. Fringe examples include color-coded garments, specific adornments, or ceremonial implements that signal readiness for marriage, skill, or virtue. You notice that even minor deviations in dress, behavior, or appearance are observed, interpreted, and catalogued. Adolescents quickly learn that navigating desire, social expectation, and personal inclination requires awareness, prudence, and subtle ingenuity. Every interaction is both rehearsal and audition for future life roles. By the end of this stage, you internalize a profound truth. Sexuality and marriage are never purely personal. They are deeply social, economic, and moral systems, intertwined with your sex, labor, skill, and reputation. Success and survival require not only adherence to expected roles, but also strategic observation, subtle negotiation, and occasional cunning. You feel that every choice, whom you admire, how you speak, what you display, is a signal in a complex network of social and familial expectation. And while your sex determines the rules and boundaries, careful attention and clever action allow room to maneuver, leverage influence, and protect opportunity. As night falls, and the soft hum of life lulls you into contemplation, you lie reflecting on the intricate dance of marriage, desire, and social negotiation. You recognize that survival in this era is not just physical or skill-based, it is relational, performative, and strategic. Your body, your reputation, and your choices are all instruments in a vast social ledger, constantly updated and carefully interpreted. And as you drift towards sleep, you feel the weight, risk, and subtle opportunity embedded in every relationship, teaching that understanding, observation, and clever navigation are as crucial as skill or endurance when your sex literally decides your fate. By the time you're fully immersed in adulthood, the distinction between public and private life becomes glaringly clear. Legal systems and justice are not applied equally, and your sex literally dictates your protection, punishment, and rights. You notice that boys are often given latitude, privilege, and formal recognition under the law, while girls' legal standing is frequently indirect, mediated through male relatives, or limited to property and domestic disputes. You begin to realize that the law is not just abstract rules, it is a tool, a social mirror, and a measure of your worth. Every transgression, compliance, or minor negotiation is filtered through sex-specific expectations, influencing your survival, social standing, and capacity to act. Historically, legal systems have codified inequality in profound ways. In ancient Rome, male citizens enjoyed legal protections, voting rights, and the ability to represent themselves in court, whereas women required male guardians to act on their behalf. Similarly, in medieval Europe, women's access to property, contracts, or public legal remedies was often mediated through husbands, fathers, or brothers, limiting autonomy while reinforcing patriarchal authority. You feel this disparity subtly in everyday life, whose voice is heard, whose disputes are taken seriously, whose testimony carries weight. It is all filtered through sex, demonstrating that law is not neutral, but a reflection of societal priorities. Fringe legal practices further highlight the absurdity and cruelty of gendered justice. In some parts of Africa and Asia, adolescent boys accused of minor infractions might be subject to ritualized endurance tests or public displays of penance, while girls' infractions, sometimes equally minor, were corrected through ceremonial reprimands, symbolic chastisements, or controlled exclusion from social events. Imagine witnessing or participating in such systems, acutely aware that compliance, perception, and performance influence legal and social outcomes simultaneously. The theatre of justice is as much about training, observation, and ritual as it is about fairness or morality. You notice that everyday disputes carry legal and social weight. Boys might argue, negotiate, or even commit minor infractions with relative latitude, while girls' actions are observed with scrutiny and interpreted in terms of morality, virtue, or social impact. Peer networks, family oversight, and communal observation act as informal courts, cataloguing behaviour and assigning reputation points that affect marriage, inheritance, and social authority. Scholars debate whether such systems were pragmatic, designed to maintain order and cohesion, or intentionally restrictive, reinforcing hierarchies and limiting female agency. You feel both truths in your daily life, as social evaluation and legal expectation merge seamlessly. Economic status intersects with legal power. Boys with property or trade experience gain recognition, authority, and recourse under the law. Girls' property, labour, or earnings are often recognised only indirectly, limiting autonomy and influence. Fringe historical examples demonstrate creative navigation. Some women in medieval Europe leveraged household control, market knowledge, or strategic marriages to gain indirect legal recognition and influence despite formal exclusion. You notice that understanding legal nuances, social perception, and familial leverage is just as important as skill or endurance for securing rights and resources. Physical safety and corporal punishment are also sex-specific. Boys might endure harsh physical training, ritualized punishment, or public trials that build endurance and reputation, while girls are more likely to experience symbolic reprimands, socially mediated corrections, or restricted mobility. Fringe anthropologists describe societies where boys underwent endurance tests in legal and ceremonial contexts, while girls were tested through domestic, ritualized, or moralized trials. You can almost feel the inequity physically. Your body is always subject to observation, assessment, or regulation, whether through labour, ritual, or legal expectation. Legal codes intersect with ritual and morality. Boys are expected to demonstrate courage, fairness, and leadership in disputes. Girls are expected to demonstrate composure, obedience, and domestic competence. Scholars argue that this combination reinforced hierarchy while also transmitting practical skills. Boys learned negotiation, strategic thinking, and conflict management. Girls learned social diplomacy, discretion, and the subtleties of influence. You experience this tension daily, realizing that your sex determines not only what laws apply to you, but also which skills are valued, which behaviours are tolerated, and how your decisions ripple through social, familial, and legal networks. Even minor acts of negotiation require strategic thinking. Boys might leverage physical skill, social alliances, or verbal persuasion to resolve disputes. Girls might rely on observation, timing, or relational influence to mediate outcomes. Fringe historical accounts describe clever women using subtle knowledge of property, ritual, or social hierarchy to influence legal or economic results, often in ways invisible to formal authorities. You sense that legal systems are rarely neutral. They reward observation, cunning, and subtle strategy as much as compliance or brute skill. Every interaction, argument, or negotiation is a rehearsal for survival in a world mediated by sex-assigned rights. Community surveillance reinforces compliance. Boys and girls are constantly evaluated in social and legal contexts. Public disputes, ritualized exercises, and family oversight act as continuous legal observation. Even minor infractions, mismanaged chores, errors in ritual performance, or socially transgressive behaviour can be interpreted as legal or moral failings, affecting marriage, inheritance, or social standing. Scholars debate whether these systems primarily ensured social cohesion or reinforced systemic inequality. You feel both pressures. Law and morality are intertwined, and understanding both is essential for navigating daily life and ensuring long-term survival. By the end of this stage, you internalize a powerful lesson. Law is not neutral, and survival depends on understanding the rules, performing them skillfully, and navigating the subtle gaps in enforcement. Your sex determines how rules apply, what latitude you have, and which strategies are most effective. Observation, compliance, strategic negotiation, and occasional subtle defiance are essential to protect yourself, gain advantage, and secure future opportunities. You sense that legal literacy is not only knowledge of statutes, but mastery of social expectation, ritual, and performance. As night descends and the world grows quiet, you lie reflecting on the intersection of law, sex, and survival. Legal systems, rituals, and social evaluation form an invisible lattice that shapes opportunity, authority, and risk. Your body, behaviour, and reputation are continuously assessed, catalogued, and interpreted, demonstrating that survival, influence, and justice are deeply intertwined. And as you drift towards sleep, you feel the profound lesson. In a world where sex dictates access to legal protection, social authority, and economic opportunity, observation, strategy, and subtle compliance are as vital as skill, strength, or endurance. As you move deeper into adulthood, you start to notice how your voice, influence, and legacy are subtly but unmistakably shaped by sex. Inheritance and legacy planning are arenas where society's priorities, fears, and hierarchies are writ large, and your participation depends entirely on which sex you were assigned at birth. Boys are trained, observed, and prepared to inherit land, livestock, business, and social authority, often from birth onward. Every action, from childhood chores to adolescent skill displays, has been quietly catalogued to measure readiness for these responsibilities. Girls, by contrast, are rarely positioned to inherit formally. Their influence is often indirect, exercised through marriage, domestic management, or strategic social networking. You feel this reality as a constant invisible pressure, shaping not only opportunity, but the way you think about your worth and potential. Historically, inheritance laws have codified this disparity. In Europe, the principle of primogeniture ensured that estates passed to the eldest son, while daughters might receive only a dowry or symbolic property. Similarly, in many Asian and African societies, inheritance was male-dominated, ensuring that land, wealth, and authority remained concentrated in men's hands. Girls' contributions, though critical to household survival, were rarely recognised formally in legal terms. You begin to see the system not as arbitrary, but as a deliberate mechanism to control wealth, power, and social continuity. Your sex determines access to the formal levers of legacy and opportunity. Fringe practices make inheritance both ceremonial and performative. In some medieval European families, boys were given ceremonial keys, ledgers, or symbolic weapons to signify future control of the estate, while girls received small symbolic tokens or household objects representing potential influence, but without legal authority. In Polynesian societies, inheritance sometimes included ritualized games or competitions to determine competency, subtly reinforcing male primacy while rewarding skill, courage, or leadership. You imagine yourself participating in such ceremonies, acutely aware that every gesture, hesitation, or display of mastery is being interpreted as evidence of readiness or potential inadequacy. Peer and family observation amplifies the stakes. Boys are compared against siblings and peers, evaluated for competence in labour, decision-making, and social influence. Girls are observed for composure, domestic skill, and ability to manage household networks. Minor lapses can carry long-term consequences. A boy who appears timid or incompetent may risk future marginalisation, while a girl whose skills are underestimated or misperceived may face limited social leverage, marriage constraints, or reduced autonomy. Scholars debate whether these systems primarily ensured survival and social continuity, or whether they were mechanisms of gendered control and inequality. You feel both truths intuitively as you navigate daily tasks and social expectations. Economic preparation intersects with inheritance. Boys trained in trades, craft, or land management are positioned to accumulate wealth and assert authority, while girls trained in domestic arts, social diplomacy, and household management gain influence indirectly, often through their spouses or family connections. Fringe accounts describe clever girls who use knowledge of trade, domestic productivity, or kinship networks to secure resources or negotiate influence despite formal exclusion. You sense the subtle skill required. Your ability to observe, strategize, and act within constraints often matters as much as talent or hard work. You notice that ceremonial preparation reinforces social hierarchies and inheritance expectations. Boys may be trained to manage estates, conduct negotiations, or wield authority publicly, often through ritualized demonstrations, mock negotiations, or contests of skill. Girls may participate in ceremonial household tasks, educational demonstrations, or displays of composure that highlight readiness for social influence rather than direct legal power. Fringe practices sometimes included secret lessons in financial management, property awareness, or negotiation strategies for girls, ensuring survival and social competence within the limited space permitted by patriarchal structures. You feel the paradox. Training is both empowering and constraining. Observation and social evaluation are continuous. Family elders, community members, and peers are always noting, cataloguing, and subtly commenting on performance, influence, and readiness. Boys' successes are often public and formalized. Girls' successes are private or relational, influencing reputation and indirect leverage. Minor achievements or failures are never forgotten, shaping marriage prospects, social alliances, and inheritance positioning. Scholars note that such longitudinal observation created a system in which social memory, skill, and perception were as important as formal law in determining long-term outcomes. You internalize this truth physically and psychologically, learning that survival requires constant awareness. Legal frameworks and social expectations intersect dramatically. Boys' legal authority, combined with social validation, positions them to inherit not just property but influence, reinforcing the cycle of male-dominated leadership. Girls' authority, though sometimes significant, is mediated and contingent, dependent on marriage, domestic networks, or symbolic gestures. Fringe historical examples include women who leverage strategic knowledge, resource management, or subtle kinship manipulation to shape inheritance indirectly. You notice that understanding these patterns requires both observation and strategic thinking. Knowing how, when, and where to act is as critical as labour or skill. Even minor miscalculations carry consequences. Boys who fail to demonstrate competence or social intelligence may jeopardize inheritance and standing. Girls who act outside expected norms risk social censure, marital difficulties, or reduced influence. Yet subtle cleverness, observation, and strategic action can create openings. Some individuals quietly amass influence through kinship, trade, or domestic skill, reshaping outcomes in ways that formal law did not anticipate. You sense that legacy is therefore not purely legal or economic. It is performative, relational, and contingent, requiring intelligence, observation, and subtle manipulation. By the end of this stage, you internalize a key lesson. Inheritance is about more than property. It is about authority, social leverage, and survival. Your sex determines your formal access, the tasks expected of you, and the recognition you receive. But strategic observation, subtle negotiation, and carefully timed initiative can create influence even within strict limitations. You realize that survival in this world depends on mastering the invisible systems as much as the tangible ones. Your body, your behavior, and your social perception are all instruments in the negotiation of wealth, power, and long-term opportunity. As night falls, and the soft hum of the environment surrounds you, you lie reflecting on the intricate interplay of inheritance, skill, and social positioning. You recognize that wealth, authority, and opportunity are inseparable from observation, performance, and compliance with sex-based expectation. Even within constraints, there is room for strategy, subtle defiance, and personal agency. And as sleep begins to overtake your awareness, you feel the complex truth settling into your bones. Inheritance is not just a matter of law. It is a system of observation, negotiation, and subtle manipulation, where your sex dictates the initial rules, but cleverness can shape your ultimate path. As you move deeper into adulthood, the weight of expectation shifts from skill and observation to influence and decision-making. Leadership roles and public authority are arenas almost exclusively defined by your sex, and navigating them becomes a subtle art. You notice that boys are encouraged, or outright required, to participate in councils, guilds, or communal decision-making, their opinions publicly valued, their authority recognized, and their successes recorded for posterity. Girls, while essential to social cohesion and household management, are largely excluded from formal leadership, their influence exercised indirectly through persuasion, mentorship, or strategic alliances. Even minor acts, how you stand, speak or gesture, are scrutinized as evidence of your readiness to assume authority or your capacity to maintain compliance with social hierarchy. Historically, male-dominated leadership was the norm across nearly every civilization. In medieval Europe, men held public office, served as judges, led militias, or represented families in trade councils, while women's leadership was mostly confined to domestic spheres, religious orders, or ceremonial oversight. In feudal Japan, boys were groomed to inherit clan leadership, manage land, and negotiate alliances, whereas girls' authority remained relational, often exercised through subtle counsel or strategic marriage alliances. You feel this distinction in your everyday life. Visibility, influence, and recognition are assigned not just by ability, but by sex, shaping the ways you interact with peers, elders, and the broader community. Fringe practices highlight the theatre of authority. In some Polynesian societies, adolescent boys were given ceremonial leadership trials, including mock debates, endurance tasks, or symbolic governance challenges. Girls might oversee ritualized domestic tasks or adjudicate symbolic conflicts, but these exercises were largely private or ceremonial, with little formal power attached. You imagine yourself participating in such scenarios, acutely aware that every gesture, tone, or subtle display of initiative is interpreted as evidence of competence or potential failure. The absurdity of performing adulthood before fully being recognized is palpable, yet the consequences, social standing, marriage prospects, and long-term influence, are serious and lasting. Observation and evaluation are continuous. Boys' successes are publicly rewarded. Recognition, ceremonial privileges, or informal influence within councils or guilds. Girls' successes are often quietly acknowledged, shaping social perception indirectly, but rarely producing tangible authority. Peer networks, family oversight, and community evaluation function as a continuous performance review, reinforcing compliance and teaching subtle negotiation. Scholars debate whether these practices primarily fostered practical leadership skills or primarily served to maintain male-dominated hierarchies. You experience both interpretations in your daily interactions, sensing that subtle observation and strategic maneuvering are as important as skill or intelligence. Economic considerations intersect with leadership roles. Men controlling property, trade networks, or labour are naturally positioned to wield authority, make decisions, and secure alliances. Women, though essential to household management and community cohesion, rarely exercise formal power independently. Fringe historical examples illustrate creative workarounds. Some women use domestic influence, ceremonial control, or kinship networks to exert authority indirectly, sometimes rivaling men in effectiveness, though never recognized formally. You notice that influence is rarely absolute. It requires knowledge of social codes, strategic observation, and careful timing to translate effort into tangible results. Ceremonial instruction reinforces authority and hierarchy. Boys may participate in public debate, strategic exercises, or labour competitions designed to measure leadership potential. Girls may oversee ritualized domestic contests, coordinate ceremonies, or teach younger relatives, cultivating social influence while remaining formally excluded. Fringe anthropologists note that these practices often tested not just competence, but composure, judgment, and adaptability. You feel the pressure to excel while remaining compliant, understanding that public authority is earned through both visible skill and mastery of social nuance. Peer dynamics further refine your sense of strategy. Boys are compared and ranked based on public performance, decision-making, and influence. Girls are assessed based on subtle observation, relational skill, and composure. Deviations, hesitation, misjudgment, or assertiveness in the wrong context can affect reputation and opportunity. Scholars debate whether this evaluation was primarily functional, preparing competent leaders, or primarily disciplinary, enforcing conformity and hierarchy. You experience both forces simultaneously. Skill is rewarded, but social savvy, strategic observation, and adherence to norms are equally essential for navigating authority. Even small acts of cleverness or subversion carry implications. Boys might leverage influence through alliances, tactical skill, or charisma. Girls might exercise covert influence via mentorship, mediation, or strategic use of symbolic authority. Fringe examples include women secretly controlling trade, managing inheritance disputes, or guiding political decisions from the background, demonstrating that leadership is not always formalized. You recognize that understanding how to navigate social structures, anticipate reactions, and exercise influence subtly can be as crucial as occupying formal roles. Religious and moral frameworks intersect with leadership, shaping expectations. Boys are expected to lead ethically, demonstrate courage, and uphold social or ritual norms. Girls are expected to advise discreetly, maintain harmony, and support relational networks while remaining within prescribed boundaries. Scholars debate whether these gendered expectations were primarily practical or ideological, promoting stability while reinforcing male dominance. You feel the tension acutely. Your sex dictates access to authority, yet the lessons of strategy, observation, and subtle negotiation provide avenues for influence even within constraints. By the end of this stage, you internalize a crucial understanding. Leadership is not solely about formal authority or skill. It is about perception, strategic action, and subtle negotiation within a socially mediated system. Your sex defines access, boundaries, and visibility, but clever observation, relational intelligence, and calculated initiative allow you to navigate influence even in a restrictive framework. Authority is as much about relational mastery and strategic subtlety as it is about legal position, physical skill, or formal recognition. As night falls and the world quiets, you lie reflecting on the invisible networks of power and influence that surround you. Public authority, ceremonial recognition, and relational influence all intertwine, shaped by sex, skill, and observation. Even small gestures, expressions, and decisions can ripple across social, economic, and marital networks. And as you drift into sleep, you feel the lessons settling deep into your awareness. Leadership, influence, and legacy are inseparable from the careful navigation of expectation, perception, and strategic ingenuity in a world where sex literally decides who is seen, heard, and respected. As you continue deeper into adulthood, the rhythms of daily life begin to intertwine more fully with expectation, obligation, and social surveillance. Family dynamics and kinship responsibilities become central, and your sex determines how you give, receive, and wield authority within the household. You notice that boys are expected to lead, protect, and manage both immediate and extended family affairs, assuming responsibility for labour, property, and public representation. Girls, while deeply involved in maintaining the household and mediating kinship relations, rarely exercise overt authority. Instead, influence is exercised subtly, guiding decisions, managing resources, mentoring younger siblings, and cultivating relationships that extend the family's reach. Every action, from your words to your posture, carries social weight, teaching lessons in strategy, observation, and patience. Historically, kinship systems reinforced these divisions. In medieval Europe, eldest sons inherited not only land but responsibility for family members and extended household affairs, while daughters were trained in domestic management, caregiving, and ceremonial mediation. In many African, Polynesian, and Asian societies, similar patterns prevailed. Male children were prepared for public responsibility, while females were socialized to maintain household cohesion and relational networks. You feel this dichotomy acutely, realizing that family survival and influence are inseparable from sex-assigned roles. Compliance ensures respect and opportunity. Deviation risks marginalization or familial tension. Fringe practices highlight the performative and ritualized aspects of kinship responsibility. In some Polynesian cultures, boys were sent on symbolic or literal journeys to demonstrate leadership, endurance, and social competence, while girls performed ritualized household tasks or mediated ceremonial disputes, demonstrating skill, grace, and relational intelligence. Imagine yourself performing these acts under the watchful eyes of elders. Each gesture, adjustment, or clever intervention is interpreted as a reflection of competence, virtue, and readiness. The absurdity of these micro-evaluations is almost comical, yet their consequences, marriage prospects, inheritance, and social leverage, are tangible and lasting. Observation and evaluation permeate every interaction. Boys' contributions are measured for skill, decisiveness, and authority. Girls' contributions are assessed for tact, composure, and relational efficacy. Minor successes or lapses are noted and remembered, influencing both immediate interactions and long-term kinship positioning. Scholars debate whether these practices primarily ensured household survival and social cohesion, or whether they reinforced hierarchical gender control. You feel the duality. These structures teach essential life skills, yet they also codify inequity and constrain autonomy, reminding you that observation, strategy, and compliance are necessary for both survival and influence. Economic and labour roles are deeply entwined with kinship obligations. Boys oversee land, livestock, or trade, consolidating family wealth and social position. Girls manage domestic production, distribute resources, and maintain social networks critical for household survival and community cohesion. Fringe historical examples illustrate clever navigation. Women sometimes used household authority or knowledge of trade to influence inheritance decisions, marriage negotiations, or community standing, effectively exercising indirect power. You sense that kinship authority is layered, requiring simultaneous attention to domestic management, social relationships, and subtle strategy. Ceremonial and ritualized tasks reinforce family hierarchies and responsibilities. Boys might lead rituals, supervise labor, or represent the household in public exercises of authority. Girls perform domestic, ceremonial, and relational tasks that demonstrate skill, moral integrity, and influence without formal recognition. Fringe anthropologists note that subtle strategic action, timing gestures, influencing decisions, or mediating conflicts was recognized and sometimes rewarded even if invisible in formal records. You begin to understand that family influence is rarely about overt authority. It is relational, performative, and dependent on observation, intelligence, and subtle negotiation. Peer dynamics further complicate kinship navigation. Boys are compared for leadership, resource management, and problem-solving within extended kin networks. Girls are evaluated for composure, diplomacy, and skill in maintaining social cohesion. Deviations from expected norms, such as a boy's hesitation or a girl's assertiveness, can influence reputation, marital prospects, or family influence. Scholars debate whether these social pressures primarily function to strengthen kinship resilience, or whether they constrained female autonomy and reinforced patriarchal dominance. You feel both realities simultaneously. Skill and observation are rewarded, but boundaries are strictly policed. Even minor acts of cleverness or defiance carry long-term lessons. Boys might use strategic alliances, demonstration of skill, or resource management to enhance their family's status. Girls might subtly manage household influence, mentor siblings, or negotiate relational outcomes to assert agency within prescribed boundaries. Fringe examples highlight the ingenuity required. Women controlling household finances, distributing resources effectively, or mediating disputes in ways that shift social outcomes without violating formal rules. You realize that kinship influence, though gendered, is as much about observation, negotiation, and cunning as it is about labor or compliance. Religion and morality intersect deeply with kinship obligations. Boys' authority and labor are often framed as moral duty, reinforcing societal and spiritual expectations. Girls' relational influence, domestic skill, and composure are likewise moralized, emphasizing virtue, loyalty, and social harmony. Scholars debate whether this moral framing primarily preserved family and community cohesion, or reinforced systemic inequities by limiting female autonomy. You feel the tension. Compliance, observation, and strategic action are essential to survival, reputation, and influence, yet clever engagement offers small openings for subtle empowerment. By the end of this stage, you understand that family dynamics are not merely social. They are mechanisms for teaching survival, influence, and negotiation. Your sex determines access to authority, labor, and recognition, but subtle observation, relational skill, and strategic action provide opportunities to shape outcomes even within constraints. Survival and influence are inseparable from awareness, skill, and compliance with expectation, and every micro-interaction contributes to the ongoing negotiation of social, economic, and familial power. As night falls and the quiet hum of your household envelops you, you lie reflecting on the intricate weave of kinship, labor, and influence. You understand that family survival, social positioning, and authority are tightly intertwined with observation, subtlety, and compliance. Even within rigid structures, there is space for ingenuity, negotiation, and quiet influence. And as you drift towards sleep, you feel the lesson deeply. Your sex determines the rules, boundaries, and visibility of authority. But clever strategy, careful observation, and relational intelligence allow you to navigate kinship networks, protect opportunity, and subtly influence outcomes that shape both your survival and your legacy. As adulthood settles further, you realize that your entire social existence is measured in alliances, influence, and opportunity. Community standing and social networks are vital, and your sex dictates how you participate, lead, and navigate these webs of observation. You notice that boys are generally positioned at the forefront of trade, public decision-making, and leadership roles, while girls exercise influence indirectly through relationships, counsel, and household authority. Every social interaction carries layered significance. Your tone of voice, gestures, posture, and attention are all being interpreted, catalogued, and evaluated. Even casual conversations are subtle performances in which competence, discretion, and alignment with expectation are constantly measured. The invisible ledger of social memory is omnipresent, reminding you that survival and advancement are relational as much as physical or skill-based. Historically, community networks were central to social survival. In medieval Europe, a boy's ability to negotiate with neighbours, participate in guilds, or assist in public projects increased his family's prestige and his own prospects. Girls, while critical to maintaining household networks, ceremonial observances and relational cohesion, rarely held formal authority in councils or trade arrangements. In Japan, women's influence was largely exercised behind the scenes, through careful management of household reputation, ceremonial competence, and strategic alliances within extended kin. You sense the subtle inequity. Influence is available to everyone, but access is strictly gendered, and visibility is as important as skill in determining opportunity. Fringe practices make social evaluation almost theatrical. In some Polynesian societies, boys were tested through mock public debates, labour contests, or ceremonial exercises designed to demonstrate negotiation, stamina, and authority, while girls were evaluated through domestic competitions, ritualised demonstrations of composure, or relational mediation exercises. Imagine participating in these events. A misstep in speech, posture, or timing could subtly influence perception of competence, while clever observation or minor strategic insight could enhance reputation and leverage. The absurdity of performing adult influence before fully inhabiting it is palpable, yet the consequences, access to marriage, inheritance, and authority are very real. Peer dynamics amplify scrutiny. Boys' success in negotiation, labour, or public displays is continuously measured against that of siblings, cousins, and peers, shaping reputation and access to future opportunity. Girls' skill in relational management, household control, and social composure is observed similarly, influencing subtle standing within the community. Minor lapses, such as awkward gestures, hesitation in conversation, or failure to follow protocol can ripple outward, affecting marriage prospects, social alliances, and long-term influence. Scholars debate whether these pressures primarily enforced cohesion or constrained autonomy, yet both outcomes are evident in daily life. Observation and strategy are essential for survival and social leverage. Economic and ceremonial intersections reinforce social positioning. Boys who manage property, labour, or trade networks are publicly recognised for competence, enhancing family standing and personal visibility. Girls who maintain domestic, ceremonial, or relational networks increase household stability and reputation, indirectly influencing status and alliances. Fringe historical accounts describe women exercising influence through strategic household management, mediation, and mentorship, demonstrating the importance of relational intelligence as a form of power. You notice that opportunity is rarely tied solely to labour or skill. Relational acuity, strategic observation, and subtle manoeuvring are equally critical. Observation is constant and layered. Boys are measured for public competence, initiative, and assertiveness. Girls for tact, composure, and the ability to maintain networks. Deviations, hesitation, excess assertiveness, or inattentiveness can influence long-term opportunity, while clever engagement, strategic alliances, and subtle demonstration of skill can enhance reputation and authority. Fringe anthropologists note that such patterns created a system in which relational, social, and strategic intelligence were valued alongside physical skill and labour, shaping pathways to opportunity in ways that formal law or ritual alone could not dictate. You feel this tension in every interaction, learning to balance observation, discretion, and clever negotiation. Religion, morality, and cultural expectation overlay social evaluation. Boys are expected to demonstrate ethical conduct, courage, and leadership. Girls are expected to exhibit virtue, discretion, and relational wisdom. Scholars debate whether these norms primarily ensure social cohesion, reinforce hierarchy, or limit female autonomy. You experience both truths. Observation, compliance, and strategic subtlety are required for survival, yet these constraints provide space for skillful navigation, subtle negotiation, and relational agency. Even private acts, conversation, body language, or small gestures contribute to the ongoing evaluation of competence, reputation, and influence. Even minor acts of strategic insight or subtle defiance are consequential. Boys might leverage alliances, negotiation, or displays of skill to improve standing. Girls might cultivate networks, mentor younger siblings, or subtly influence ceremonial or domestic decisions. Fringe practices highlight clever manipulation of social systems. Women managing household resources, subtly guiding decisions, or mediating disputes could exert influence comparable to formal authority, even if invisible in official records. You notice that social mastery is relational, performative, and contingent, requiring intelligence, observation, and strategic action, rather than merely labour or compliance. By the end of this stage, you internalise a fundamental lesson. Community influence is inseparable from observation, relational intelligence, and subtle negotiation. Your sex determines formal access to visibility, authority, and opportunity, but subtle strategy, careful timing, and relational skill allow navigation of power even in constrained environments. Survival and success are less about brute skill, and more about understanding social codes, anticipating perception, and leveraging relational networks. Your body, behaviour, and awareness are all instruments in the ongoing negotiation of social influence, reputation, and opportunity. As night falls, and the familiar hum of life quiets around you, you lie reflecting on the intricate web of social, economic, and ceremonial expectations. You understand that visibility, influence, and survival are intertwined with observation, discretion, and strategic action. Even minor gestures carry weight, shaping alliances, reputation, and opportunity. And as you drift towards sleep, you feel the lessons settle into your awareness. Social networks, community standing, and relational mastery are as essential as skill or labour, and navigating them requires constant awareness, cleverness, and subtlety in a world where sex literally decides the rules of engagement. As adulthood reaches its full breadth, you begin to sense that your life has been a long apprenticeship in compliance, observation, and strategic subtlety. Final rights and elder status are the culmination of a system in which your sex has dictated opportunity, responsibility, and recognition. You notice that the culmination of life, ritualized recognition, respect, and authority, is always framed by the social and biological expectations assigned to you from birth. Boys, having navigated labour, public authority, inheritance, and ceremonial expectation, are often celebrated as elders, granted visible decision-making power, and honoured for sustaining family and community continuity. Girls who have laboured invisibly, managed households, mediated networks, and cultivated relational intelligence achieve elder recognition in subtler ways, through family loyalty, mentorship, ceremonial skill, and preservation of social cohesion. You feel the paradox clearly. Influence and legacy are real, but their visibility, reward, and formal acknowledgement are entirely filtered through the lens of sex. Historically, the path to elder status was highly gendered. In many African, Polynesian, and Asian societies, male elders were entrusted with public decision-making, religious guidance, and dispute resolution, while female elders exercised influence in domestic, ritual, or community mediation spheres. Medieval Europe presented a similar structure. Men retained formal authority in councils, property management, and ceremonial leadership, whereas women often exerted quiet authority within households and kin networks. You notice that every act throughout your life, skill, labour, compliance, and observation, feeds into this final stage, determining the degree of influence, respect, and legacy you may achieve. Fringe cultural practices make elder status both ceremonial and performative. Boys might undergo public rituals, receive symbolic objects of authority, or participate in communal adjudication exercises, marking their successful navigation of decades of social expectation. Girls, meanwhile, might oversee ceremonial gatherings, guide younger generations in domestic, social, or ritual knowledge, or quietly mediate disputes, earning recognition indirectly. You imagine yourself performing these acts, aware that subtlety, composure, and relational mastery are as important as skill, endurance, or public recognition. The absurdity of achieving lifelong influence through largely invisible acts is almost comical, but the stakes are real. Family cohesion, social continuity, and personal legacy all hang in the balance. Observation remains constant to the very end. Younger generations watch, record, and learn from the actions, gestures, and strategies of elders, ensuring continuity of the social system. Boys' public successes are memorialised in councils, public ceremonies, and familial prestige. Girls' contributions are encoded in kinship networks, household stability, and ceremonial competence. Scholars debate whether these mechanisms primarily ensured survival, preserved social knowledge, or reinforced systemic gender hierarchies. You feel both truths. Structure preserves order and teaches strategy, but it also enforces inequality, demonstrating that careful observation and relational intelligence are critical for influence, survival, and legacy. Economic and inheritance considerations remain intertwined with elder recognition. Boys who successfully managed property, trade, or labour inherit not only material wealth, but prestige and influence over subsequent generations. Girls, having managed households, mediated relationships, or cultivated social cohesion, leave a different type of legacy: respect, kinship loyalty, and subtle influence that may outlast formal authority. Fringe anthropological studies illustrate cases where women used accumulated relational and ceremonial knowledge to shape succession or resource distribution, influencing communities invisibly but powerfully. You notice that elder influence is therefore multifaceted. Wealth and visibility intersect with relational acumen, observation, and strategic subtlety. Ceremonial knowledge and ritual expertise consolidate recognition. Boys often gain authority through public instruction, ceremonial oversight, or adjudication of disputes, demonstrating mastery over the skills, labour, and compliance required throughout life. Girls gain recognition through mentoring younger generations, overseeing domestic and ceremonial knowledge transfer, and preserving moral and social cohesion. Fringe examples highlight that even subtle demonstrations, properly conducted rituals, mentorship, or strategic guidance can secure elder status, suggesting that mastery of observation and strategic influence is as crucial as labour or formal power. Peer and family networks reinforce legacy. Boys' public leadership and property management are acknowledged in ceremonial displays, councils, and community recognition, while girls' mentorship, relational guidance, and household management are acknowledged through kinship loyalty, reputation, and subtle social influence. Minor lapses in earlier life, hesitation, misjudgment, or deviation from expectation may have ripple effects into elder status, whereas skillful navigation, clever observation, and strategic subtlety enhance long-term recognition. Scholars debate whether these patterns were primarily functional, ensuring continuity, or restrictive, reinforcing hierarchy and limiting autonomy. You feel both pressures as you assess your accumulated influence. Even small acts of ingenuity, subtle guidance, or strategic mentoring are amplified in elder status. Boys leverage formal authority, public visibility, and ceremonial recognition. Girls leverage relational skill, mentorship, and domestic or ritual knowledge to shape future generations. Fringe accounts highlight clever interventions, women guiding property distribution, mediating ceremonial disputes, or influencing family alliances invisibly but decisively. You realise that the culmination of life is not only about labour, skill, or compliance. It is the mastery of observation, negotiation, and subtle influence across decades, demonstrating that legacy is relational as much as formal. Religion, morality, and cultural expectation continue to frame elder recognition. Boys are celebrated for upholding ethical standards, public responsibility and leadership. Girls are honoured for maintaining harmony, mentoring, and guiding kin and community. Scholars debate whether this moral framing primarily reinforced social cohesion or perpetuated gendered inequality. You feel the tension. Compliance, observation, and strategic action remain necessary even in elderhood, yet subtle ingenuity allows for influence beyond formally recognised authority. Every act of guidance, mentorship, or subtle decision shapes not only your legacy, but the opportunities and behaviours of future generations. By the end of this stage, you internalise the ultimate lesson. Elder status is less about formal authority than about strategic observation, relational intelligence, and mastery of subtle influence across a lifetime. Your sex has determined formal opportunities, visibility, and recognition, yet careful attention, cunning, and relational skill provide enduring pathways to shape social, economic, and ceremonial outcomes. Survival, influence, and legacy are inseparable, and every act, public or hidden, formal or symbolic, has contributed to your capacity to navigate, observe, and subtly steer your world. As night settles and the soft hum of life drifts into the background, you lie reflecting on the long arc of your life. Decades of observation, labour, skill, compliance, and subtle negotiation have all led to this moment. The culmination of influence, recognition, and legacy demonstrates the intricate web connecting sex, social expectation, and strategic action. You feel the lesson in your bones. Survival and authority are as much about cleverness, relational mastery, and observation as they are about labour, skill, or compliance. And as you drift into the gentle embrace of sleep, you understand that life, like all its rituals and evaluations, is a careful negotiation where your sex determined the rules, but insight, strategy, and subtlety ultimately shaped your fate. As you lie in the quiet hum of the night, the full tapestry of your life unfurls in your mind. Every glance, gesture, and choice has been a thread in a vast weave of social, economic, and ceremonial expectation. You can see now how your sex determined the rules of the game from the very beginning. Who could inherit, who could speak in councils, who could claim authority, and whose body and labour were observed, measured, and evaluated. Yet the story is more nuanced than simple restriction. It is also a lesson in cunning, observation, and subtle navigation. Survival, influence, and legacy were earned not only through compliance, skill, or endurance, but also through careful attention to social cues, relational networks, and the tiny openings where ingenuity could flourish. You reflect on the many ways your life has been a balancing act. Your body and desires, your labour and learning, your gestures and words, each were instruments in the constant negotiation of fate. You feel the paradox. Even as the system imposed rigid hierarchies and gendered limitations, it also offered subtle avenues for agency, creativity, and influence. The hidden ledger of observation, evaluation, and strategic action has been quietly accumulating for decades, and the lessons it imparts are profound. Awareness, patience, intelligence, and social acumen are as essential as physical skill or wealth. As the night deepens, you sense the long arc of history, ritual, and society settling around you. Your sex has shaped your path, certainly, but it has also taught you to read the currents of expectation, to navigate the unseen pressures, and to seize the small spaces where action and influence are possible. And in that understanding, you find both the weight of tradition and the quiet thrill of agency. You breathe slowly, letting the hum of life and the invisible lessons of centuries wash over you, finally realizing that fate is neither entirely given nor entirely fixed. It is negotiated, observed, and quietly mastered by those who learn to see and act within the rules of the world.